From the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C.
Good afternoon. Welcome back. I think you met me this morning, but I am Katie Smith, and this afternoon I'm very proud to be introducing three pioneering women in the field of geospatial intelligence. Dr. Annette Kriegel here served 38 years as a federal civil servant in the Department of Defense in organizations associated with mapping and imagery. Dr. Kriegel was the program manager for the Defense Mapping Agency's digital production system, and that's the system I talked about a bit this morning. She was program manager during its critical design, integration, and delivery phases. She was later the chief of the Central Imagery Office. Dr. Kriegel has received numerous awards for her achievements, including the Distinguished Civilian Service Award from the Secretary of Defense and a Presidential Rank Award. She was inducted into the National Geospatial Intelligence Agency's Hall of Fame for her contributions. Next, we have Roberta, or Bobby Lenkowski, who spent 28 years in the public sector. She retired in 2005 from the National Geospatial Intelligence Agency after a distinguished career as a technical and management leader. I will also mention that during this time, Bobby and her husband, Jerry, raised 6 daughters. Mrs. Lenkowski has represented NGA on a number of federal advisory committees on remote sensing, and she has also served as president of the American Society for Photogrammetry and Remote Sensing. Bobby was the recipient of the 2013 Arthur C. Lundell and Thomas C. Finney Lifetime Achievement Award presented by the United States Geospatial Intelligence Foundation. She is the first female recipient of that award. Bobby is also a member of the NGA Hall of Fame. And then, lastly, we have Letitia A. Long. Tish was the director of the National Geospatial Intelligence Agency from August 2010 till October 2014. She is the first woman to head a major U.S. intelligence agency. During her tenure at NGA, she led efforts to establish the agency's map of the world for intelligence users, and under her guidance, NGA became the first U.S. agency to adopt open source software development to deliver its software for the first responders for collaboration. Prior to her appointment to NGA, Ms. Long served as the Deputy Director of the Defense Intelligence Agency from 2006 until 2010. Before that, she held top-level positions in the DoD and CIA. Ms. Long began her career as an engineer at the Navy's David Taylor Research Station. Tish has been the recipient of numerous DoD and intelligence community awards and has received multiple presidential rank awards. Ms. Long was given the Charlie Allen Award for Distinguished Intelligence Service by the Armed Forces Communication and Electronics Association. Among all of her recognitions, she was also named one of the most powerful women in D.C., in the D.C. metro area by Washington Magazine in 2013. So there you are. So now, introducing Dr. Annette Kriegel.
Good afternoon. It's a pleasure to be part of this collegial event. And I'm going to take you on into the past, kind of like an oral history, and talk about a venture that was a game changer for the technology available in the mapping community and for the Department of Defense professionals that were part of that community, and for our focus today, for the women. This venture took place in the early 80s and to the early 90s in Defense Mapping Agency, an organization which since has merged and integrated into today's National Geospatial Intelligence Agency. But to go back to the early 80s, Defense Mapping, or DMA, was a major combat support agency in the Department of Defense. It produced annually millions of copies of graphic products, MCNG products, mapping, charting, and geodetic products. You'll see me slipping into these acronyms. MCNG products, a few of which were digital at the time, also called soft copy. However, it relied on film-based collection platforms, on film-based source materials, and it had a very aging production infrastructure in the early 80s. You saw some of that from Katie Smith's presentation this morning. Lots of piece parts, lots of little systems, lots of manual processes to get the job done. I'm certain you got a sense of that from Tanya when she talked about her years in dealing in this piece parts, manual, a few computer era. However, the backlog of critical products from military customers was growing. DMA was not meeting its requirements. And in the early 80s, at this same time, a series of congressional studies took place that looked at the future. And what the future saw was digital imagery collection platforms coming. What it saw was military customers with smart weapons who needed digital versions of products that DMA produced. It needed digital terrain, digital cultural information, and digital targeting information. Also, if you look to the future, shipboard navigation required digital products, and commanders in the field wanted digital terrain information. And oh, by the way, produce faster and produce everywhere on the globe, not just Cold War areas. So in February '82, Congress mandated to DMA modernize production. And this wasn't just a modernization, this was a critical need. Create a digital production infrastructure, a digital production pipeline that started with digital imagery and could produce digital products and hard copy products. Now, this was considered really hard and very risky. So Congress gave DMA 10 years to do this modernization. And the undertaking was called the Digital Production System, DPS, and it was delivered 10 years later in November '92. Now, why was this so hard, and why did it take so long? Well, it was revolutionary in operational concept. Basically, nobody knew how to do this. It became clear early on that only 10% of the technology required to do this job was commercially available, 10%. The size of the imagery materials was 100 to 1,000 times greater than commercial files of the time. There were no networks to move this information around. The data storage requirements ran into the terabyte range when megabytes pushed the state of the art, and we're very nonchalant about our yottabytes today. There were no commercial processors to do certain functions like correlate stereo imagery. And how do you populate a database of cartographic information? How do you best access it? It was researched, it was postulated, but it was not a very well understood concept. And this was very large scale. It was intended for thousands of users. So when this modernization went forward, because it was so hard and so risky, it received a huge investment of research and development and procurement funding, over $2 billion at the time, over that 10-year period. But at the time of delivery, the digital production system consisted of 7 major systems replicated at the production facilities. It consisted of a system of systems of these 7 systems. And examples of the systems were to do data extraction, to generate digital products, to provide data services for the networks and the database management. There were 3,000 pieces of equipment delivered, including 2,000 workstations. There was 10 million lines of code development, including 2 million rules for a computer to assist a cartographer. And there was 380,000 square feet of facility needed to house all that equipment. This was a big deal. So who were these masked men and masked women who pulled this off? Well, for starters, DMA created a special organizational unit for this modernization with one single manager accountable and in charge. The buck stops here. It's kind of that manager. But in the early 80s, DMA had a college-educated workforce with plenty of graduate degrees. However, at the time, in the early 80s, few women held senior positions and key leadership positions throughout the organization. The DPS undertaking was a huge, unique opportunity. People who had critical skill were paramount, and they came forward from inside the DMA, and some applied from outside. Women stepped in to manage, lead, and work in this decade of undertaking at the beginning, midway through it, and at the end. And when it was finally delivered, in the transition of all this technology into the workforce, into production. At the beginning, women managed major systems like communications. Women ran the acquisition core to compete, award, and monitor large system contracts, contracts for large-scale engineering and integration services. A woman became the financial manager of this entire development. How do you estimate over 10 years at the beginning when no technology exists and concepts exist and designs exist only on paper? How do you estimate the cost year by year? A woman did that. A woman set up the processes to monitor cost and schedule and risk throughout that development. At the delivery time, women were running the data services system activity. They were leading the production management system. They were accomplishing system of system engineering. Women spearheaded the government team to develop those 2 million rules for computer-assisted heuristics, for feature extraction, for product generation, and for production management. When the digital production system transitioned to production, approximately 3,000 professionals were on the receiving end of this new technology. Women were among those holding key positions to manage the workforce through this major cultural change. Two of those leaders from DMA are here today. Katie Smith and Bobby Lenkowski were two of those leaders. Now, for my part, I participated at the beginning of this venture, and then I got to be the one in charge of the DPS at the time of its critical design review. So for those of you familiar with DoD milestones, a critical design review is the time in a development's life when you understand all the requirements and the concepts and you're ready to go out and bend hardware and build software. Except it wasn't mature. And all the risk assessments were red. And a government and industry team came in, and they basically said that the DPS was off the charts in terms of complexity. And they said it was one of the largest R&D system developments ever attempted in the Department of Defense. And they weren't sure what the metrics predicted as to when this system would ever be finished. So heeding these warnings, we did take action. We convened teams of people we called tiger teams. Basically, they got locked up in rooms for 7 days a week, 16 hours a day, until all the designs were finished. Then they got to come home. We added a system integration phase within the schedule. So we basically put a whole body of activity to test how each of those systems in the systems of systems work together to be sure they worked correctly and could pass the right information around to one another. We added special tools for testing, and we introduced incremental phasing of products in delivery. So as a result of taking a lot of actions in response to those warnings, the DPS was delivered on schedule and within cost. Its success changed the way DMA did its mission. It changed the workforce. It established beyond doubt that women would and could perform critical roles. To quote Machiavelli, one of my favorites, "There is nothing more difficult to take in hand, more perilous to conduct, or more uncertain in its success than to take the lead in the introduction of a new order of things." With DPS, women succeeded in highly visible, risky, and difficult jobs. And from women in DMA expected and received more responsibility, recognition, and promotions into key positions. Many of these women became the leaders in what today is the National Geospatial Intelligence Agency. So, a footnote about the transformation of the commercial sector. At the beginning, in the early 80s, there were a few major companies in the mapping, charting, and geodetic business. After this venture, there were many more companies because they had been part of the development with their subcontractors over a 10-year period. There were more companies capable of offering commercial products that were related to mapping. And there was a significant growth of expertise in the commercial sector, in the industrial base, that was outside of the government expertise. During the development, the technology of the digital production system was spun off into a whole bunch of derivatives and commercial products. And this occurred during the development and afterward. Now, why during? Well, during, there were a whole series of crises that occurred. So while the DPS was cranking on its beautiful design and development, there were incidents like Desert Shield and Desert Storm that needed to use the most effective, up-to-date technologies available. So a whole series of rapid prototypes were spun off of the development and put together into mini segments to support needs like that over the 10-year period. And they became very, very successful. After the delivery, the developers of the DPS, these contractors who had been part of developing the large systems, ended up taking commercial versions and having them out on the marketplace. Examples like high-speed, high-resolution scanners and film writers, low-cost imagery workstations, software packages that were COTS to do geopositioning and targeting, feature extraction, and product finishing. So as a result, again, of this huge investment that took place over a 10-year period, the marketplace for the mapping and charting community technology was galvanized as a result of that investment. The game was changed. And I'll now stop and return to the present. Thank you.
Now, one of the things that Annette did not tell you, and I said I would if she didn't, is, as she mentioned, the number of women who were involved in that major delivery of the system of systems owes a great deal to Annette's influence. Her leadership of the program, both in those stages before she actually took over full responsibility, and then, of course, once she had full responsibility, was to assure that women of quality and talent were, in fact, involved to ensure that there would be a successful delivery. Now, I can say that because I didn't work for Annette. However, she didn't tell you also that the digital production system really had two phases. It had what was called a Mark 85 and a Mark 90 stage. And I inherited on the technical side something called the Mark 85.1 and the Mark 90.1 activities, which were intended to build upon what she was delivering in terms of understanding how that would change our technical interaction with our customer suite. So, you know, I owe an incredible amount to Annette in terms of my own career opportunity. What I'm going to start with here today is a photograph that I often use as kind of wallpaper for the first part of my discussion. And I was in college when I first saw this, and so I'm going to give away my age too. It was 53 years ago, on February 20th of 1962, that astronaut John Glenn became the first American to orbit the Earth. Now, he completed 3 orbits in just under 5 hours. And at the time, he reassured Americans that we were on a par with our Cold War adversary, the Soviet Union, which had successfully launched cosmonaut Yuri Gagarin for only 1 full orbit 10 months earlier and lasting only 108 minutes. Now, in terms of fame, we remember the Soviet cosmonaut as the first man to orbit the Earth, and we remember John Glenn as the first American to orbit the Earth. But there actually intervening there was a German who also orbited the Earth. We forget, it's the first that count. And we particularly take pride in John Glenn's accomplishment. But 3 hours after his launch from the Cape, right at the beginning of that third orbit, John Glenn, as the then amateur tourist photographer, he captured this panoramic view of Florida. And that's taken from about the Georgia border just north of Cape Canaveral. So his American homeland at that time was 162 miles beneath him. I have the Cape in sight down there, he noted to his mission controllers. It looks real fine. From up here, I can see the whole state of Florida just laid out like on a map. Beautiful. So I doubt that John Glenn at the time realized how prophetic his words were. And I certainly had no idea how they would be a factor in my own professional career. Just laid out like on a map. Now, today's college student would find nothing remarkable in those words, okay? Whether with Google Maps or Microsoft's Bing Maps, they fluidly move with a single click from a traditional map view to images that are overlaid with streets and names. And years intervened as I completed my undergraduate and graduate program and became a proficient stay-at-home mom. But in the meantime, and I'm one of those map nuts, okay, I continued to nourish my childhood fascination with the state travel maps and world atlases. In my mind, geography and maps were kindred interests. And that's how my generation, of course, learned geography in grade school. A map was a way to show where something is, how to travel from point A to point B, where people live, okay, or to gain some limited context about what's in the vicinity. A map established boundaries and place names, and for those who like to travel a bit, highway numbers. And as Katie pointed out this morning, and I have exactly the same words in my paper, a map allowed us to vicariously visit intriguing places. Remote sensing was clearly not in the commonplace vocabulary, and of course this morning we heard to whom that phrase is actually attributed. However, the human experience of the fundamental definition is. Remote sensing involves gathering information about an object, an event, or a situation without using the sense of touch. So our eyes and our ears and our noses are, after all, remote sensors. And that photograph that John Glenn shared was remote sensing from space, an extension of our eyes. About 15 years after having seen Florida from space, I began to link maps and geography with photographs from space in my daily work. So I have a long professional bias about the specific and the irreplaceable value of remote sensing to traditional mapping, based on starting my federal career with defense mapping. Now, in fact, I have never completed a military specifications compliant map or chart, but I have been a cog in the process. Okay. My entry into this exciting world began as a photogrammetrist. So we've heard about cartographers and geodesists, but I began as a photogrammetrist. I care about camera calibrations and interior and exterior orientations. That's the geometry of the angles that are associated with the camera. And I care very much about accurate and precise geopositioning. So initially at work, the reliance for source material was upon classified national assets and was film-based. When I started, those were the Corona collections that Katie talked about earlier this morning, now declassified and actually freely available to you in scanned form through the distribution of the United States Geological Survey's Earth Resources Observation and Science Center in South Dakota, that's known as EROS. Today, little remains of film-based mapping. Digital collections, whether they're panchromatic, multispectral, LiDAR, radar, or other, provide the source data. And of course, as the commercial remote sensing capabilities have emerged and flourished, they have augmented and supplemented the national collections. Now, from the outset of my federal career, managers taught that quality photogrammetric work at the front end of the cartography production line must generate high-quality control for subsequent elevation derivation or feature location from satellite or aerial or even handheld photography. Large equipment like the device shown here with these multiple optical comparator stages would allow the stereoscopic views of photodipositives. And this was a workstation, in fact, that was used well into the 80s. And Katie showed you an example of another one this morning, which was an analytical system that, in fact, was computer-driven. These were computer-driven, but you'll also notice that they were hand-driven, okay? Women, as well as men, did operate these machines quite effectively unless their stature was very small. It was very difficult to put those film dipositives, they were 9-inch film dipositives, between the glass plates and actually mount them on the stages. I mean, that's a physical activity to be able to reach into those, into that big box that's sitting there. But the results of the work were, of course, of very, very high quality. And the intent was obviously to be able to recreate that three-dimensional or that stereoscopic view at the moment the film in space had been exposed. They were precision engineered, they were very costly. They were nowhere, obviously, in the vicinity of the camera's eyes when the images were collected, but they did allow us to collect the information from which we could derive ground positions. Now, remember I told you I love to vicariously visit places. Well, imagine the first time I sat down on one of these machines and had this top-down view in stereo of a part of the world that I would never have expected to visit. It was like I was there. I was almost distracted away from doing what I was supposed to be doing, which was to be collecting, measuring points. But what's important about those is that there were computers that were responsible for processing either the tape or the punch card output from the extraction work, and they were massive Unisys mainframes at the time. I followed behind Katie being responsible for a department at Defense Mapping and Data Services, where we also added to the collection of those Unisys mainframes the IBM mainframes that Annette was delivering. So we had lots of computer processing power that took up an incredible amount of physical space. But the cartoon that's shown here is a variation of kind of the expected workflow steps once the information had been extracted from the photographs. And I want you to note that this is kind of cyclic because there were all these steps in the process. The analysis of the data anomalies, of the measurement quality required hours at one's desk. So you had that workstation, but then you went to a desk elsewhere to be able to put together your punch card decks to take down to the computer room in a day or 2 days to be able to get your massive printout to take back to your desk, to do the analysis on, to realize that you had to go through the process all over again. This was often a recursive activity. There are very few people who made it through the process with a first try, and that everything had worked out perfectly. So it's a cartoon, but it is very, very representative of the work that we did. But using the remotely sensed data in this way improved the accuracy because we knew very well what the location of the camera had been. We knew all of its parameters, having done the camera calibration. And the extent of the global geographic representation was improved by giving us access to distance and otherwise often denied information. So the map sheet or the chart that was in the pocket of the foot soldier or in the cockpit of the pilot or was on the bridge of the captain became significantly more reliable because of our exploitation of remote sensing. We could answer questions like, where is something of strategic or operational interest? How can I reliably reach it over land, by air, or across the water? And what additional contextual information might be represented in the standard military symbology? Keep in mind that symbology is the data compression of mapmaking. So we talk about, the compression that we do on images today to be able to manage them through the system, but symbology is a data compression technique. So contour lines will tell me something about the topography. The cartographic symbols will identify routes, railroads, waterways, populated places. Only land surveying would have been more accurate in generating the ground control. But we were usually dealing with inaccessible areas and very large footprints. And we lacked the time, the surveying manpower, and the access to many of those places of military interest. So using the photogrammetric triangulation was the accepted alternative technology to land surveying. Now, my career and its involvement in the technology chain, in fact, represents a remarkable period of time. And that's been mentioned by nearly every speaker that in the past 50 years, that some of our careers have spanned, there have been remarkable changes. And we have been party to them, and we have been actively involved. But the evolution of the portrayal of geographic information from paper maps to computer screens, and of the use of geographic information from primarily visualization to intense analysis aligns quite coincidentally and quite intentionally, as Annette pointed out, with the diminishing use of photodiapositives and the introduction of digital imagery, first from scanned film and then from digital cameras. And that evolution is captured in the emergence and the maturing of geographic information systems, or GIS. In today's world, professionals talk so much about GIS that the discussion seems to overshadow its overwhelming dependence sometimes on remote sensing. And as the technologies, in fact, have emerged, they've also allowed increasingly complex integration of digital imagery for traditional mapping objectives and for very sophisticated imagery analysis, constantly improving that human-machine interface. Hence, in the mid-1990s, the federal agencies consolidated into the National Imagery and Mapping Agency, which subsequently did rename itself as the National Geospatial Intelligence Agency. So here's an example, quite a contrast in terms of a work environment between this and the VILD A10 that I previously showed you. So just as the digital imagery has replaced film, powerful compute-intensive desktop workstations with immediate photogrammetric triangulation and image processing have replaced the old stereo plotting machines, the mainframe computers, and days of iterative reprocessing. As Dr. Kriegel pointed out, the delivery of the digital production system opened the doors to commercial development of hardware and software and laid the groundwork for the GIS tools that we all know about or that we actually use. Her work stimulated a technology leap not just for intelligence and defense, but for civil agencies, for the private sector, for academia, for each of us. We would doubtlessly have reached where we are today, but it could have taken several years longer for the technology development and its transfer and its penetration down to the cell phone level. We take for granted what in fact was an incredible investment, not only of funds, but of manpower and intelligence. So today, a company can advertise, and I quote, a web-based application that delivers instant access to imagery of any format, as well as the ability to modify, exploit, and publish, and all within a standard web browser. 20 years ago, how many of us were web savvy? Yeah, that's right. So remotely sensed data that's used to extract information for geographic presentations or for geospatial analysis most commonly comes from the airborne and the satellite platforms, but it will increasingly come from small unmanned systems and handheld devices with cameras. Only a couple of decades ago, the personal and the daily use of remote sensing data, particularly from satellites, would have been perceived as some esoteric goal. Today, those tools like the Google or the Bing Maps facilitate the widespread use on even handheld devices. And most users do not care and do not worry whether the map graphic or the geospatial data from the database is derived from the imagery or if the imagery was warped to some pre-existing graphic or geospatial information. Those users, and we're all among them, assume immediate and dependable access to reliable global mapping information to include both graphics and images. So I want to give you an example of the area of that photograph in the beginning. No clouds, orthorectified to give that above, looking directly down, map-like in only two-dimensional perspective. And what are the observations as you look at that in comparison? Well, clearly there's a use of multiple images over time that have been mosaicked together to remove the clouds. There are still no magic elixirs to erase clouds from pictures. There are some NASA capabilities on the current Landsat 8 satellite that in fact help scientists deal with some of the cirrus clouds, but still nothing to do that with typical photography. Okay, the effects of the exterior orientation. Remember I told you it was one of my interests, okay, which are the angles in the collection geometry, have been adjusted to remove tilt and object layover. Processing has rescaled images that are used in the mosaic so they fit together. You take images from space, they're not all the same resolution, certainly not all at the same angles. So you mosaic together, you have to do some image processing. And the computer-aided tonal adjustments have been introduced to obscure the boundaries of the mosaic pieces. But with this control over single pixels, not just the image as a whole, but single pixels, the use of the image is extensive. So I'll give you one example here. Again, still using Google Maps tool. Gives me the ability to tilt the view. So took that orthorectified view that you looked at, top down, and simply using the app, I'm able to take all that same information and tilt it, and I can emulate that initial photograph. I guess I could paint in clouds. You know? And if I tilt it a little bit more, you'd be able to see the horizon. But the taking angle is slightly different. So at any rate, you know, there's so much today that we can do in terms of manipulating the remote sensing. But I don't know that you can see it from there, but what I find interesting, and I just did a screen capture with this, obviously, is that there's a little box there that have questions in it. And I think they took this from one of my slides from 30 years ago, right? The directions from here, the directions to here, what's here, search nearby, measure distances. And if you were to be doing this live, if you click on what's here, you will get across the bottom little pictures that then have, you know, lines that go to cities or areas of interest upon that map view. So there are all types of things today that are a result of much of the work that has been done in the past, supported by things like the digital production system. Now today, I continue to work with those who use remote sensing. So yes, I am retired from NGA. But those that I work with today who use remote sensing are not doing it in my traditional mapping sense. I'm serving as the executive director of America View, which is a nonprofit consortium of 40 state-implemented and university-led members called State Views. They are not photogrammetrists. They're not cartographers. They are, to some extent, GIS users. They are earth science educators and researchers. And Landsat and MODIS, which of course have medium to low spatial resolution and represent quite a departure from my high-resolution geospatial intelligence expertise, but those collectors play heavily in their use of remote sensing. Here's a picture of the NASA's Earth Science Earth observing instruments that are in space. In the slide, you'll notice that there are satellites that have just been recently launched. These are all in use, and they represent both active and passive collections for various activities that are taking place on the Earth. They provision these, and this is where I felt envious today when Tanya was talking, because all I did was screen capture this, and I actually had to modify the screen capture. But these are what are called the global maps of NASA, and you can look at these at what's called earthobservatory.nasa.gov. Each of these has an animation that sits behind it. So if you were to click on any one of these worlds, these maps, you would be able to see change over time if you go to the animation. So they range from, the aerosol, carbon monoxide, vegetation, clearly something we're very familiar with noting on our traditional maps, water vapor, sea surface temperature. So therefore, for me, the term mapping associated with remote sensing, which this is, has a new meaning in this adjunct career. But it allows me, again, the opportunity, when I talk with those with whom I'm currently working, to emphasize why the where is so important and why accurate geopositioning is critical to understanding what is happening in this world of ours. From those America View members, I'm learning so much more about geography. Okay? When I was in grade school, learning about geography from maps, the focus is very much upon physical geometry, what you saw there, and of course, our geography. And of course, those of you who are practitioners know that we tend to categorize now geography as physical geography, human geography, and of course, the environmental geography. Here it is, in those 16 different views using the NASA instruments. So where there's a passion for a discipline like geography, we're all lifelong learners. Yeah. So thank you for the opportunity to talk today.
Good afternoon. And I will try and kind of bring the two of those presentations together and talk a little bit about NGA today. So as Bobby said, I have never completed any, whether it be mapping or imagery product. I didn't, like Annette, build any digital production system or imagery or mapping system. In fact, when I was telling my parents that I was going to be appointed the director of the National Geospatial Intelligence Agency, my mother kindly said to me, "What do you know about GeoInt?" Thanks for that vote of confidence, Mom. And what I said to her, pardon me, what I said to her was, I'm a user. I'm a customer. I have long used geospatial products, weather mapping, weather imagery. And I think they want me for my leadership and management skills, Mom. So work with me here. You know, be a supporter as I'm walking in the door. And in fact, as Katie pointed out in her very kind introduction, I have held many different positions across the intelligence community in the Department of Defense. And so I did have truly the background in using the products. And, pardon me, I want to go back to a couple of things that each of these three women said, and actually I'll also borrow from some of our earlier speakers. Katie said that Desert Shield, Desert Storm was the beginning of a new era in our business. And it actually was the impetus to form what is now the National Geospatial Intelligence Agency. Yes, we had an amazing digital production system that Annette ensured got delivered. Yes, we had a lot of remote sensing capability. We did not, as a Department of Defense and an intelligence community, do a very good job in getting what we knew to our military customers. We knew a heck of a lot more in Washington, D.C. than we knew on the battlefield. And so when you talk about our customers, in fact, at that time, during that period of hostilities, we did not do a good job in delivering what we knew to our customer base. And so there was a study, as we do in Washington, that eventually resulted in the formation of the National Imagery and Mapping Agency. Fast forward about 20 years to 9/11, and we had a brand new director of then the National Imagery and Mapping Agency, retired Lieutenant General Jim Clapper, who is now the Director of National Intelligence. Jim took over several days after 9/11, in fact, 2 days after 9/11, with a criticality in his mind to really begin to realize what the agency had been put in place for, and that was to bring the imagery and mapping disciplines together. And in fact, NEMA had done that. We speak in acronyms, as my three predecessors have said. NEMA, the National Imagery and Mapping Agency, had brought together pieces of 6 different organizations from the intelligence community and the Department of Defense, but in fact have brought them together truly in name only. Inside that organization, there was an imagery part to the organization and a mapping part to the organization. And there had been some experiments done to, as we say, exchange hostages, put some of those photogrammetrists and cartographers in with the image analysts and put some of the image analysts in with the mappers. But in fact, we had not yet begun to realize the capability, to realize what could be. And so when Jim Clapper took over, he had in his mind about a 6-month plan that he was going to work to truly bring those two disciplines together. Well, he put that plan on steroids because of 9/11. And in fact, it is more than just a name. The name change from imagery and mapping to geospatial intelligence was really, really important, and coined the term geospatial intelligence, or GeoInt, which really is the integration of the two disciplines. And the mission to deliver that geospatial intelligence to our many customers, and to do it in a way that we almost anticipate. Bobby talked about getting it's safe. Excuse me. Bobby talked about getting the information where it needs to be, when it needs to be, so that we can anticipate, is really the mission of the National Geospatial Intelligence Agency. And what I want to do is describe a little bit about what we do. And I will tell you, probably 5 years ago, you never would have had a panel like this, intelligence at the Society of Women Geographers. And one of the things that Katie said in introducing me was that while I was the director, we really moved into an era of transparency. So the mission to deliver geospatial intelligence, timely, actionable, the customer set from the president and the policymakers to the war fighters, and that's from the Secretary of Defense to the soldier on the battlefield, to others in the intelligence community, and then also increasingly to the first responder. And the way we enter into an era of transparency is largely that customer set, the first responder. So take the amazing capabilities that we have, that all of us as taxpayers invest in, that we use for secret missions, we can also bring to bear for disaster recovery operations. Think earthquakes, think hurricanes, think wildfires, any natural disaster that occurs. We can use our remote sensing capabilities to give first responders insight into what has happened and what might continue to happen, and therefore what they need to focus on and where they need to respond to first. Think also, and an example that I wanted to use is the crisis in Africa, Ebola. So NGA used remote sensing capabilities, geoanalysis of imagery, as well as the deep understanding of that area from a mapping perspective to give insights and to deliver product, whether it was maps, whether it was elevation data, whether it was an analysis of helicopter landing zones as to where those teams needed to go in to work with the Africans to deliver healthcare. And so this truly was about as transparent as an intelligence agency can be. NGA made all of their unclassified data relative to this available on the World Wide Web, not password protected, not behind a firewall, to any humanitarian entity that needed access to this information, any healthcare organization, from the World Healthcare Organization to the individual countries that were trying to deal with this crisis, to our military, who was also going in, and used all of this information, also developed applications that they put out there on the World Wide Web, again, that healthcare providers could use to get a good understanding of the situational awareness and what was happening at a given point in time. All of their data layers, all of their many products, all of their many maps, and also put several analysts forward to help with the interpretation of that data. Again, you don't necessarily think of an intelligence agency that is doing that, but in fact is a part of the mission. Let me back up a little bit and talk a little bit about, as I came in to be the director of the agency, doing an amazing job in supporting the customers across our many mission sets, but again, maybe not in the most transparent way, and a lot of it in almost a brute force way. And so we entered into an era of really trying to make all of our information accessible online and on demand, which resulted in the ability to be able to do this, to really make this information available. And it is, I would say, truly a new era, if you will. Another example, which many folks are certainly aware of, the operation to, at the time, capture Osama bin Laden. A lot of background work was done to get us to this point, the point of the operation. And there were three main agencies involved in addition to the military, and that was the Central Intelligence Agency, the National Security Agency, and the National Geospatial Intelligence Agency. And what NGA brought to this mission, obviously, was an understanding of the area, of the terrain, finding the compound based on the work that NSA and CIA were doing. We went through thousands and thousands and thousands of images to try and pinpoint where this compound might be, as we were vectoring in on a number of compounds in the area, because we had that name Abbottabad from some of the work that NSA and CIA had done. This was a particular compound that our analysts, the number one analyst being a woman, I should point out, honed in on because of how different it was. In this area of Pakistan, actually in all of Pakistan, land is very expensive. So when a compound is built, buildings are built out to all of the walls around compounds. You notice in here a lot of open area that signified wealth. Also in this area of Pakistan, there weren't typically walls that were built that high. These are 9 foot high in some areas, 16 feet in others, to give the privacy so folks around couldn't see inside and see what was going on. Another thing that we noticed, our women analysts noticed, was that trash was not being put out. It was being burned. I don't know, I'm just saying, but that might not be something that men would recognize as they're looking at imagery. So, I mean, men and women, we are different. We do look at things differently. And so, of course, the theory being that those inside the compound didn't want anything found within their trash, which was why they were burning a lot of it. Folks in the surrounding areas never saw very many people leaving the compound. There would be folks going in, but in fact, if there were children, they weren't going to school. This was an area actually that didn't have a lot of homeschooling. And so another thing again that women were thinking about, where are the children? Why aren't they going to school? Well, they were being homeschooled. As I said, there were folks going in. So this was an area that actually NGA knew a lot about because there were several military academies in the area, and so had studied the cultural aspects, the human geography aspects of this area, and so very rapidly focused on this particular compound. Took the imagery from this, built scale models, and then worked with the SEAL team to build a full-scale model to help them practice as they were getting ready to go in for the operation. In going back through imagery, we didn't have the compound while it was being built. We did have it going back in time for a while, so could see various buildings being built over time, but never saw it not under roof, and so really couldn't give them a sense of exactly what it looked like inside, but worked with a number of Pakistani Americans on what it might look like, and so worked very closely with the SEAL team as they were planning their operation and what they could begin to expect as they would go into the compound. Fast forward to May 1st and May 2nd. Many folks think of May 2nd as the culmination of this operation. We actually identified the compound about 2 weeks after I took over the running of the agency, and a team came in and said, we need to talk to you about something we think we may have found, and walked me through what we knew, what we didn't know, and off they went to brief the director of CIA and on up the chain. That was in August. This operation took place in May. Very short evolution for the operation. On May 1st, I was at Langley. There was a team of folks there, a team of folks at the White House, and obviously multiple teams forward. And it was, our analysts who really had a lot to do with the success of the operation to brief the SEAL team ahead of time when they went in on what they could expect, things to be looking for. And I think everyone knows that the operation, in fact, was a huge success. And again, largely dependent on our watching, learning, and putting together what could happen, which is, in fact, what did happen. And as I mentioned, our lead analyst on this was a young woman who briefed at a junior analyst who briefed at very senior levels. And then as we had the opportunity to talk with the SEAL team afterwards, one of the things that she asked was, what didn't you know that would have helped the operation? And they basically said nothing. You walked us through everything about the compound, everything to expect, down to very significant details that I think, really ended up very much helping with the success of this operation, which certainly one of the highlights of my time there, but I think also the highlights of many folks there, because what the National Geospatial-Intelligence Agency does is all about saving lives. Let me stop there, because I think we have taken a lot of time.
We're running just a little late, but I'd like to give everybody a chance maybe to ask just a few questions before we stop for a very short break. Do we have any questions out there?
I have one I'd like to ask you. You've been in photogrammetry for many, many years. I'm very impressed with your knowledge, and you're still doing it. But I have one question. Every time we manipulate something, sometimes we get better and sometimes we get worse. And so whatever we do, are you finding that people are putting some sort of a quality control over each step now, so that, example, we had, say, someone who is on a ship who thinks there's an island, and they have GPS and they think it's, right on. But it isn't always right on, but they think they know where they are. and then the island is, they think they know where the island is. But sometimes it can be off, depending on, you know, the quality of the data we get. We can only do what we can with what we get. But is there a way that people are actually coding things now so that the people who are the users can have an idea of what is the quality of the remote sensing that they're getting?
So again, it's going to depend entirely upon what your production source is. Those people who are working against those kinds of certified processes understand that they have to associate with the information they're providing something called metadata. And the metadata is the information about the data. So it will tell you something about certainly the origin of the data, what are the quality expectations in terms of making a decision as to how you would use it or you wouldn't use it. But from a photogrammetric standpoint, as an example, I've spent quite a bit of time talking with people who in fact believe that the image is always better than maybe some other vector information that you have about the geography. And you cannot make that assumption. An image itself, in terms of its collection, geometries, and how well you know the calibration of the system, and I mean the entire system in this case, can sometimes be worse. But the tendency will be that the picture is always more accurate, and so therefore you move the vectors to fit the picture. When that may be fine for the alignment, for what we call the conflation of that image and its vector data, but in fact you have to really understand what geographic position you take. Do you take it from the image, or do you take it from the vector and create that in terms of your final product? So yes, I think that's always a challenge. I mean, we all know about people who rely upon their GPSs in their cars and find themselves in very bad situations. You know, that's...
Maybe just a couple more. Do we have any more? Over here.
I'd just like to say thank you, because I am an old NGA DMAer, and it was a lovely trip down memory road. I've actually made a lot of the products. I sat on that machine, that Wild, and I haven't seen it in years. But just because of the work that you all have done, I had a lot of pride in what I was doing. But it was nice because when I first started there, it was such a male-dominated world that I remember when they announced Dr. Kriegel, and it was just like, oh, we've got a woman, you know? So thank you all for being here. This was a real treat. I really appreciate it. Thanks.
Thank you.
We have one more, maybe? In the back. Oh, great, a young person.
I just wanted to add to that comment, just thank you for the progress that you made for women today coming into the workforce, and you know, I hope you feel appreciated, and you know, if you feel that there's work still to be done in those areas, I'd like to hear your thoughts on that.
I just said always.
I took over the agency in 2010, and a lot of folks, from my mother to then Secretary Gates, made a big deal about the first woman to run a major intelligence agency. I look at Annette and say, Dr. Kriegel ran the Central Imagery Office. She was the first woman.
It was a smaller
It may have been smaller, but had you not done that, Annette, had you not, you know, broken that glass ceiling, which you certainly did.
Thank you.
It would not have been possible. And had Bobby not after 6 girls, decided she was going to go back to work, shown that our young women today can do both. Because I lived through the era of you can't do both. I have 3 wonderful stepdaughters, but I didn't get married until I was 40 because I didn't think I could do both. I wish, Bobby, I had met you earlier.
You'd have had 6 daughters?
I might have had 6 daughters. So we have made tremendous progress, but we will not be there until we stop saying the first woman too.
That's right.
So in response to that question, Tish, would you also, perhaps the audience doesn't know some of the other senior women that are out there in the intelligence community today that may not be so visible in the newspapers. Would you comment about the positions women are holding today in the intelligence community?
So there are 17 organizations in the intelligence community today. All but one has, actually all but 2, have a woman in either the number 1, number 2, or number 3 position. When I started 30 plus years ago, that was unheard of, yes, 0, and that's not A-OK. So we have made tremendous progress, and it is in large part due to women like Dr. Kriegel, Bobby Linkowski. It is also due to very forward-looking men. All 3 of us know a guy named Jim Clapper, who is the Director of National Intelligence, who, if you look across the intelligence community today, mentored or placed a large number of those women across those many organizations. So things look very good today, and I think they will only continue to look even better tomorrow. But truly, it won't be until we stop saying the first woman too. But yes, Annette, it is a good point, because in all in all but those 2, one of them has had a number 1 in the top 3 previously. One has not. That would be the United States Marine Corps. I'll just call them out. But they're working on it. I can say that.
You say we can have 5 minutes, or we can take 5 minutes? 5-minute break. Okay, thank you very much.
And again, just to introduce myself, I'm Kim Cruz. I'm the past president of the Society of Women Geographers. Our current president, Ann Schneider, is in Iceland today. So she sends her greetings. The Society of Women Geographers is an interesting group. I was traveling in New Zealand a few years ago, and I had sent messages to all of our members in New Zealand. And a couple of months after I came home, I got an email from one of the folks who had not responded, and she said, "I'm so sorry that I didn't get back to you. I was doing field work in Antarctica." And I'm like, okay, I guess that's a good excuse. Our second panel this afternoon, we're moving from the history to applications. So we're going to talk about mapping applications. And our presenters this afternoon, our first presenter is Jacqueline Nolan. She's a cartographer and GIS specialist who coordinates the Congressional Geography Program for the Library of Congress's Geography and Map Division. She holds dual bachelor's degrees from Mary Washington College and a master's from the University of Wyoming. She has served multiple federal agencies during her civil career, including the U.S. Geological Survey, where she received recognition for her contribution to spatial applications in GIS for National Hydraulic regression model. She has published maps in peer-reviewed scientific journals, Congressional Research Service reports, and books. Paisley DeBianca is the GIS coordinator of the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency, Region 5. She's in Illinois. And she began her career in 2009 as an intern. Her duties include providing GIS training and GIS support for emergency response. She is also adjunct faculty at the Geography Department of DePaul University and has taught at Northeastern Illinois University, where she holds a graduate certificate in GIS. Her master's thesis research examined transit-oriented development as a solution to reduce climate change. Her research interests include GIS, cartography, East Asia, urban geography, new urbanism, and linguistics. And she's very busy. In addition to serving as a board member of the Geographic Society of Chicago, she is membership chair for the Society of Women Geographers. She's also a member of the Association of American Geographers, the Illinois GIS Association, the Illinois Geographical Society, the Japan America Society of Chicago, and Federally Employed Women. And she also is a recipient of the Society of Women Geographers Evelyn Pruitt National Minority Fellowship for 2012. Nicole Trenholm is an early career scientist with a background in geology, GIS, and hydrography. As program director for Ocean Research Project, which she helped co-found, she is determined to investigate the ocean's emerging threats, serving multiple scientific disciplines by providing worldwide, affordable, and environmentally benign ocean-going data collection platforms. Nicole sails for science, education, and exploration to encourage the sustainability of our oceans. You may find Nicole's team sailing in remote, jeopardized marine environments, such as the North Atlantic and Baffin Bay. In 2013, her team conducted a plastic debris survey of the North Atlantic Gyre, and this summer they are planning to explore the glacial melt in Baffin Bay. Nicole's professional objective is to encourage future generations to adopt strategic solutions to balance the relationship between people and the planet's oceans. And Nicole is also a member of the Society of Women Geographers. And I'm going to start with Jacqueline Nolan, and I welcome you to present to this group.
Good afternoon. It's an honor to speak here today, and I wish to thank the Society of Women Geographers for this invitation. My presentation today is Beyond the Boundaries, Illuminating History Through Modern Mapping Technology. It's based on my work here at the Library of Congress. Historically, maps have been compiled and produced using data acquired from varied sources such as verbal communication, field studies, and mathematical models. Over the centuries, maps have been drawn to specially represent possession, place, events, or documenting new geographic discoveries. Maps communicate information about human activities and movement, their places and possessions. Maps define order in a society, depicting prosperity, protection, or control. Using modern mapping technologies such as GIS software and georectification tools, cartographers can analyze data for its veracity as well as for gaining new insights about these spatial relationships and events. This presentation will focus on 3 examples for modernizing historic geographic data through the application of digital mapping technology. The first example demonstrates the connection between a national treasure and an historic transportation survey. In the second example, the ethnographic representation of a conflict region is revealed by comparing historic boundaries. The final example is a digital adaptation of Exploration Journal accounts and Indigenous Intelligence, completed during a historic survey of Western North America for the purposes of national expansion, commerce, and scientific study. The Library of Congress Geography and Map Division houses an array of domestic and foreign articles, including maps, atlases, and a growing body of digital geospatial data. In addition, it includes many other unique items of geographic interest, including three-dimensional objects and celestial and space exploration maps. Some of the digital data are born digital and are acquired through direct deposits, such as federal data, while others are acquired as donations or as purchased data sets. In other instances, such as with my position as the coordinator of the Congressional Cartography Program, we create digital data. The collections within the Geography and Map Division serve as a unique and limitless resource for spatial analysis using current digital software technology and tools. Within the Geography and Map Division reading room, patrons can access equipment to digitally scan and collect materials. The library houses a scanning lab to develop specialized products for congressional and library-wide needs, including commemorative images and exhibition materials. Additionally, the lab provides custom scans for patrons as a fee-based service. The Senate Curator's Office documents and curates many of the unique furnishings, objects, and everyday heirlooms of the United States Capitol to provide a complete picture of the institution and its needs and the needs of its members. Working with curator Amy Elizabeth Burton, I developed a map for inclusion in her book entitled "To Make Beautiful the Capitol," based on her research of a series of landscapes located in the Senate wing of the building. Constantino Bramiti was born in Rome, Italy. He trained at the prestigious Arts Academy and excelled at painting and illustration. He was commissioned by the Vatican in 1840 to restore many of the beautiful frescoes located throughout the palace. Beginning in 1859, Bramiti was employed by engineer Montgomery C. Meigs to decorate the newly constructed House and Senate wings of the United States Capitol. Bramiti's artistic contribution to decorating these interiors spanned 25 years, leaving a lasting legacy of beauty, grace, and historic symbology. This slide is a panorama of the Bramiti corridors located in the United States Capitol. The Capitol interiors have recently undergone an extensive renovation with special effort devoted to documenting the original materials used to decorate its floors, walls, and ceilings. The 1855 Pacific Railroad Survey Map is currently online and can be viewed and downloaded from the Geography and Map Division's American Memories webpage. The Pacific Railroad Survey's official report, authored by Congress, was published between 1855 and 1861 as a 12-volume set. Bramiti reflected the national debate concerning the building of the Transcontinental Railroad when he created 8 landscapes located in the Senate wing of the Capitol. These medallions were adaptations of illustrations published in the survey's expedition report. This slide depicts the 8 landscape medallions painted by Constantino Bramiti as they would appear in panels on the walls of the Capitol. In her book, Curator Burton documents that 3/4 of the 8 Bramiti medallions depict landscapes from the Northern Survey, bracketed by the 47th and 49th parallels. It is believed that Bramiti relied heavily on Volume 12 of the Pacific Railroad Survey Report for his inspiration, drawing from the generously illustrated publication. Several online public resources, the Geographic Names Information System and the U.S. Geological Survey National Map Viewer, were used to identify and verify the feature coordinates to accurately map the landscape locations. This slide depicts the multiple raster and vector layers used in the development of the final map of the Pacific Railroad Survey and landscape locations. Using GIS technology, layers containing historic and current data can be processed and combined into a single digital map for display purposes or for future research, thus providing the opportunity to quantify statistical information for comparative analysis. Georeferencing tools combined with GIS applications provide a platform for combining data of historical records to reveal their unique relationship as illuminated through the historic decorative arts of the United States Capitol. Second example. Ukraine is a large country comprised of plateaus and steppes stretching from the Black Sea to the Baltic Sea. In the spring of 2014, Congressional Cartography intern Christina Sabo selected a research topic for which she looked at the territorial changes within the historical boundaries of Ukraine from the mid-9th century to the present. To analyze its current conflict with Russia, she studied the ethnic complexity of Ukraine. This map depicts the historic boundaries of the region of Ukraine. A series of historic maps, both from the Geography and Map Division's collections and from other sources, were analyzed by Christina for the study to determine the political boundary shifts, starting with a map depicting Kievan Rus, the empire of a Viking prince who ruled from 870 to 972 AD. Over the centuries, various peoples, including Slavics, Vikings, Poles, and Russians, claimed the region as their own, settling and cultivating the lands for agriculture and trade. Christina developed this map as an interactive web application to depict the shifts in Ukraine's historic boundaries. Christina developed a slide presentation to document the methodology she used in preparing a digital raster map for use in her analysis. This slide depicts the series of steps she describes as the process for georeferencing historic maps to compare their boundaries with the modern political boundaries. These slides eventually will be made available to the public through the Geography and Map Division's online GIS portal. Ukraine remains a country with a diverse population, as evident in this portrayal of ethnic minorities. Data was extracted from the 2001 National Population Census of Ukraine, an online publication. The population survey was collected and documented based on Ukrainian administrative districts called oblasts. The most recent conflict in Ukraine began in November of 2013, the result of a failure by then Ukrainian President Viktor Yanukovych to sign a trade agreement with the European Union, agreeing instead to a treaty with Russia. This project revealed some interesting details about the ethnic complexity of Ukraine as tensions between the two countries continue to escalate. Key factors at stake in this conflict are ethnicity, politics, and trade and economics. We continue to see political tension and the willful annexation of the Crimea by Russia. Ukraine is the center of conflict once again between Western and Eastern influences. In 2003, the U.S. Geological Survey issued this commemorative poster of the Lewis and Clark Exploratory Expedition 1804 through 1806. For his pending book on the sources of information used by Lewis and Clark and their final map of their report, Geography and Map Division Chief Ralph Ehrenberg selected to use this Geological Survey shaded relief map for accuracy in recording the historical events of the survey. I digitized Lewis and Clark's route for a map to be included in this new publication. This map is a screenshot of Lewis and Clark's routes. A modern U.S. boundary layer was added to correlate current geographies with documented descriptions of features from the records of Lewis and Clark. Using the shaded relief map as a base layer, this map illustrates the routes of the Corps of Discovery. For part of their exploration, Lewis and Clark retraced their earlier travels. Purple lines indicate outward and return directions along the same route. Red indicates outward route deviations, and blue indicates return route direction deviations. Indigenous accounts were historically recorded by various means, such as verbal communications, tracings on the ground, or even on animal hides. Clark incorporated information gathered from many sources into his final published map, including accounts provided by indigenous peoples. As was recorded, this sketch map by native Akamaki was significant as it records several prominent land features located in the current state of Montana. Knowledge about America and Ukraine's past were enhanced through the use of new mapping technologies to analyze their historic records. Old maps become important information sources for unlocking previously undetected truths or trends about places, people, or events. Ukraine is depicted as a complex and culturally diverse country, interested in protecting its sovereign boundaries against Russian aggressions. The record of American Western exploration is beautifully revealed on the corridor walls of the United States Capitol. And Native Americans' knowledge helped to guide the early exploration of Western landscape in pursuit of America's future expansion and economic development. Thank you.
Okay, hello everyone. Again, I'm Paisley DiBianca from US EPA Region 5, and so I'm going to give you it's pretty much a regional perspective about what it is that the EPA does when it comes to mapping. The mission of the US EPA is to protect human health and the environment, so that's what all of our activities are done to support that. As you may or may not know, the EPA was established in 1970, so a relatively young agency in terms of the history of US agencies go. So, all right, I pushed the forward. There we go. Okay, so this is one of my favorite slides, one of the internet memes. And so GIS analysts, so at the top left, what my friends think I do, they think I make Google Maps. What my mom thinks I do, she thinks I do the maps that are in her Garmin device. What society thinks I do, they think I'm the people out on the street, you know, with the surveying equipment. Of course, the surveyors think I'm just a, you know, silly kid playing in a sandbox. What I think I do, I think I'm in this great room with all these screens and monitors and machines and devices. I actually do have 2 monitors on my desk. But what I really do, I monitor our plotters and our printers and change the ink when somebody needs ink or paper. I mean, really, that's what it breaks down to. So what I'm going to talk to you today about is a little bit of history of the geospatial at EPA, some of the trends over the past 25 years, and as Kim mentioned, I've only been with the agency since 2009, so I've only got just over 5 years experience with the agency, but I found some evidence. Yes? Oh, okay. I got a lot to talk about, though, Kim. So I would talk about what I found some evidence in our back room about what's been going on geospatially with the agency, and then a little talk about what the future is looking like is going to be happening with us. All right, so 25 years of GIS at EPA. So we celebrated 25 years last year in 2014. I know you can't see this timeline up here. I'm going to point out some highlights. But it was pretty awesome. We had a celebration in the Potomac Yards here in Washington, D.C. Geospatial at EPA is supported not just by federal staff, but we also have several contractors that support us, and we also have partnerships with our states, with our tribes. So EPA, Geospatial at EPA is really a collaborative effort. Some of the highlights, in the late 80s, National Mapping Requirements Program was established and several regions implemented GIS. In 1991, there was an EPA forum on GIS. In 1993, the GIS work group completed its EPA GIS strategic plan. So, within the onset, we were realizing how important that this tool. I mean, it makes sense. What does EPA? Environmental Protection Agency. We look at the Earth. What better way to record the Earth than using a GIS, right? In 1995, and this is pretty unique, I think, we established the Mason Hewitt Award to recognize excellence in GIS. So we have our own award, the GIS community at EPA, where we recognize excellence amongst our peers in GIS. And so this is an award that's given annually. So the first time that was awarded in 1995. Okay, women. In 2004, our first Geographic Information Officer was a woman, Brenda Smith. I did not have the opportunity to meet her, but I think it is pretty significant that our first Geographic Information Officer, our GIO, was a woman. In 2005, and this is where the community really coalesced, we all came together. I say we as if I was part of this. I wasn't yet with the agency. But in 2005, we, the GIS community, EPA, came together to respond to hurricanes Katrina and Rita. If you think about the way that the EPA is divided, so the country is divided into 10 regions. So Region 5 is the states that go around the Great Lakes from Minnesota to Ohio. So that's Region 5. Region 6, is going to be Texas and Louisiana and the other states that are part of Region 6. But, there's not enough staff. So, we come out and we support each other. One of the things that we have is a response support corps, and the best way I can describe it is like Doctors Without Borders. It's geographers without, how can I say it? It's GIS without limitations within the agency. So, for example, if there is an incident that happens in one region, then the staff from all of the EPA can come together and support this. So the GIS community really came together to support the hurricane situation in Region 6. And this is when the community really got really strong in that support. And then, like I said, before I do that one, in 2012, we launched our Geo platform, which is our enterprise instance of ArcGIS Online. And I'll talk a little bit more about that. But that happened in 2012, and like I said, in 2014, we had our 25th year. So what does this whole thing look like nationally? This is kind of how we're configured. We have an EPA GIS work group. We're guided by the Geographic Information Officer. I'll try not to use too many acronyms. So we're guided by our GIO. He takes advice from our EGAC, our Geospatial Advisory Committee, and then we have a work group steering committee, and then a National GIS work group was, again, comprised of all of the GIS analysts and contractors and so forth from throughout the agency. And what's bulleted there are all of our different subgroups. So a lot of the innovation that happens in the agency within the subgroups, it comes from the regional area, it comes from our subgroups, and it trickles up. So we're really, we're not looking to headquarters to give us some guidance. We often tell headquarters what they need to do, which is really nice. And then regionally, the way we're kind of structured, all right, this is full of federal alphabet soup here. But what this is representing is how we are arranged in Region 5. We're a decentralized shop. So ISS is the section that I'm in. It's the Information Services section. And then radiated without that, we work very closely with our divisional GIS leads. So we have Water Division, our Land and Chemicals Division, Air and Radiation Division, Superfund, not super fun, and GLNPO, which is the Great Lakes National Program Office. So all of the GIS, we have GIS leads in each of our program offices that work with my section. My section, we're the ones that do the training, we acquire the software, we maintain the geodatabases for the region, we control our Region 5 GIS users group. We have a state GIS work group. We work with our state partners, and again, that GIS response support team, which is part of that National Support Corps, and then also continuing operations. For example, if something happened in downtown Chicago, we're ready to set up shop in a satellite location. And the major project that I've gotten to work on has been NATO. In 2012, the NATO G8 summit was scheduled to be held in Chicago. It turned out just being NATO. So here, these are GIS analysts in the field. This is us in our native environment. We work in dark rooms with computers. We don't ever see the sunshine. That was I'm working for the Environmental Protection Agency. Here's your computer in your dark room. Get to work. So 25 years at EPA. So to prepare for this presentation, I was digging around in our back room, and I was like, well, what kind of historical record do we have? And I found these old crunchy yellowed parchment, like onion skin papers, and the best guess I can give is this is a famous digital line graph that we talked about in graduate school, and here's one that's actually printed out. So it's just a black and white of a topo map. So I found these rolling around in our back room. And then an actual aerial image, something taken from an airplane, as we've see some demonstrations about this. And then the first GIS. How many of you, I'm sure, because we've got a lot of experience in this room, how many of you worked with Mylar sheets over a topographic map? So the first GIS, and it was really, this one had 2 layers. It had 2 Mylar sheets on it. So I thought that was pretty fun to check this one out. And then when I joined on with a couple years after I joined on, as we prepared for NATO, what we did is we prepared these map books. An atlas of the event, which was really nice. So this event was a multi-agency event. It was led by Homeland Security, but we gave the GIS support. EPA was responsible for giving the GIS support. So we put together this map book. It's the biggest project I've worked on since I've been with the agency. There was over 20 maps that they were used by everybody that was a participant. So we had Department of Energy, Homeland Security, Chicago Fire Department, Chicago Police Department. So it was a lot of different groups working together on this. But we were the local geospatial authority. I mean, we could look at national data sets. Some of you probably work with the HSIP data. And that's an acronym I can't decipher right now under pressure. But these are national data sets. And, we were finding some inconsistencies with some of the data because we had the local knowledge, and we were able to fill in that local knowledge so that our map books were authoritative. But, this technology, had some limitations. You had to have to represent everything you wanted on that paper map. You had to, if you had lots of different things to represent, then you get into symbology challenges, and then, we've got at the top, at the bottom, there's an inset map, and then on the side there, you see the key, a lot of text, a lot of reference, you got to flip through this big box. So, part of the challenge was that, the map book, and I'm really running out of time. Kim, you told me to slow down, and I got more stuff to talk about. So let me see, let me bring this together here. So what we realized, there's some limitations, and it was around this same time that we adopted the ArcGIS for Flex, and we started developing web maps. And then what it turns out is our incident command team really enjoyed having that immediate situational awareness because we could put stuff up on this web map. Once this map book was printed, it was done. We weren't going to be making any edits to this. So the web mapping has really taken off at the agency. The poor plotter, the ink in here, it's all expired. I've got inventory of ink and paper that, I hope it still works. I hope nobody prints anything because I don't have any supplies for it. But that poor thing is just, it's decrepit. Not getting a lot of use. So here is some example of some of the softwares that we use. It's not an endorsement of any particular product, but this is some of the stuff that we use. We are an Esri shop, so we do use all of Esri products. As I mentioned, we have the enterprise license of ArcGIS Online, which is our geo platform. Google Earth Pro for whatever the future, if you guys know what happened with Google Earth, we're seeing what's going on with that. Navtech, we get a lot of our data from Navtech. NatureServe, Digital Globe, and Pictometry. And I've got an example about Pictometry that I'm going to share with you in a minute. So the EPA Geo platform, the way that we're using ArcGIS Online is not only to use intra-agency collaborative mapping, but we're also using it to share out data and applications and tools to the public. One of the applications that we're using in Region 5, and that subset there, you can see a map that's built in the Geo platform. And what it is, it's a public-facing map that the public have access to see what kind of activity that the EPA is doing in the Little Village and Pilsen neighborhoods. These are historically industrial areas. If you follow Chicago at all, we had a couple coal plants that were recently closed down, and they were in this community. This community is also a Latino community, so again, it also speaks to environmental justice issues. So this is one of the ways that we are using the Geo platform in our agency. So, as I said before, with the NATO, we started using the Flex Viewer, as we called it, ArcGIS for Flex. We're now using the JavaScript version of this, and this is a screenshot of data from our DDRD, Disaster Debris Recovery Database, which is a database that we've developed in Region 5. Lucy Stanfield in our Land and Chemical Division spearheaded this. And what is a collection of sites where you can responsibly dispose of materials from a disaster? So, for example, if there's a flood and there's refrigerators or propane tanks that need to be disposed of properly, down trees. So this is just a really nice way you can search the appropriate recycler to take those materials. And what you're seeing here is a screenshot from the web app builder from Esri. And what's really nice, you see over there on the left, those little tiny icons, is how you can see what your map is going to look on different mobile devices. Esri has just now recently come out with their app studio for ArcGIS, which will allow you to even, so this is just how a map will be viewed on different types of mobile devices. The App Studio for ArcGIS will actually help you build a device, so it's built specifically for a different application. They just came out with this technology recently. So we are moving towards, web mapping we've totally embraced. This is the next, not hurdle, but this is the next delivery option that we're moving to, is developing for the mobile. Now, pictometry, I was going to say, so this pictometry gives not only high resolution imagery, it gives that imagery obliquely. Every pixel in this image has information in it. Our enforcement and compliance folks love this imagery. They can actually measure accurately, heights of these storage containers, heights of smokestacks. So, think back, that photo, that aerial image from the airplane, and now we've got these super enriched satellite images that have even higher resolution than those photographs and are embedded with lots of information. So that's kind of where we're going. So the geospatial future, one of our previous speakers spoke about, where are we going to be? Where did we think we were? Think about where we were 20 years ago. I took I'm going to age date myself. I took a word processor to college, so I'm not that old, but I'm not that young either. But I took a word processor to college. Little did I know that I would be typing out, memos and letters on a telephone. And so now what we've kind of got existing side by side, we've got our analog, technology, still paper maps and GIS. And this is a little misleading because GIS is not going away. GIS is always going to be around. But we're finding ourselves having to move into web, having to move into mobile, and then data analytics. And we're just starting to scratch the surface with data analytics. We've started to embrace open source GIS because that allows us to do a lot of things that we can't do with Esri. At our recent National Work Group meeting, one of our colleagues that works in the Office of Research and Development got hold of shipping data. So every ship that is in the waters has a GPS device on it, and he got a hold of a sample set of this data, and he's discovering there's so much information there. But without these data analytics tools, he's using Hadoop and another one that's called Tableau, which we're just starting to get involved with. He's starting to discover things that he didn't even realize, and he's only scratched the surface. You could see him saying, "Oh my God, look at all this information I've got, all this data he's got," and he's just only beginning to see things. Aside from just where the ships are going, there's other interpretations that you can make from this data. And I still want to make sure that I'm covering all the topics that I wanted to go here. Oh, and the Internet of Things. So not only we've got the data analytics and like the shipping data, Internet of Things. How many of you are Fitbit fans? I think I might see a Fitbit out there. Fitbit has got all kinds of information about what a middle-aged woman does, how many stairs she climbs every day. Who knows what they're doing with that information? And that middle-aged woman is me, believe it or not. If I had a Fitbit Surge that has a GPS device into it, then they know where I'm doing all these fitness activities. The Apple Watch. How many of you know about the Apple Watch? That's got GPS device built into it. I could be sending my heartbeat to my partner in Chicago right now. Talk about, we've all seen that, how geography has made the world get smaller, or transportation has made the world get smaller, and travel times are much smaller. I can send my heartbeat to my honey back in Chicago while I'm here in DC. That's crazy. That's crazy talk. So this is just a nice little graphic from our last work group meeting, kind of highlighting some of the things that we've been focusing on. Geospatial development, training, story maps. Esri keeps coming out with more products. They're coming out stuff faster than we can learn it. I was like, slow down, Jack, please. We can't keep up with you. Getting out more of our data and our web services, and then continuing to develop our Geo platform. And then finally, this is just a small snapshot of the women I get to work with at the EPA that are in GIS. This is not all of us. This is a small snapshot. In the lower left-hand corner, the woman in the multicolored shirt, that's Carmen Massot. She is my section chief. She was my mentor to help me bring on. She's also a member of the Society of Women Geographers. And then the top left is Ann Duncan. She's our newly appointed information chief Chief Information Officer. And this is a woman who comes to us with 20 years experience at Hewlett-Packard, and she was most recently the Chief Technology Officer for Palo Alto Unified School District. So she's going to be leading overarching the whole information technology for the agency. I think it's really awesome to have a woman in that position. So I told you, Kim, I had to rush because I had a lot to get through. I went a little bit over. I hope that's okay. But I just want to say to everybody, just keep mapping, whether you're a consumer of a mapper or a creator of maps or a consumer of maps, just keep doing what you're doing. This has been the most incredible group of women to be around today, and you few men that are in here, you guys are pretty cool too. But it's really great to have this full force of women. So thank you for listening.
Hello, everybody. Yes, I am Nicole Treadholm, and I'm going to be talking a little bit about the ocean. So we're moving from land to sea now, and I'm going to give you my background as how I've gotten into mapping the ocean, the different manners that I've been involved in doing so. So earlier on in my career, I started working for NOAA Office Coast Survey, which is where my GIS world really exploded. I really got to learn about how powerful a GIS tool is, how many different data sets you can overlay, and how you can analyze that to get real information that's going to help industry and questions that we may have about our local environment. So I was with NOAA. I started off down at the Atlantic Hydrographic Branch, so it's kind of a reverse way of learning about a mapping product. So I was down at the Atlantic Hydrographic Branch reviewing various hydrographic surveys that the NOAA Office Coast Survey do in our coastal waterways. And I was able to learn the process of taking the data and then turning it into some kind of usable product. So taking hundreds of thousands of little data points used from sonars that the ships would run off of their boats and turn that into just a few soundings on a nautical chart that's going to represent the information that a mariner would need to be safe and for commerce to keep on moving. So I did that for a little while, and it really opened up my world. I learned a lot about research and development of various oceanographic scientific technology, but I was starting to have a bit of a change of heart, and I wanted to more directly be involved with doing what I could in observing and recording the ocean condition as related to some of the emerging marine environmental problems that are out there. And so a couple years back, I had that epiphany, and a little bit time later, I met a fellow named Matt Rutherford who had quite a journey. He sailed around the Americas alone, nonstop, and through the Northwest Passage in 2011 into 2012. And what he observed was, well, first of all, he made it through the Northwest Passage. So as you can see, the Arctic environment is steadily warming. And he was able to get through there and then sail along the Pacific, around Cape Horn, and into the Atlantic, where he was where he had quite a bit of marine debris bump off his boat from time to time. So I realized that Matt and I have some shared goals here. And he took the ammunition from his record-making adventure, and we created the Ocean Research Project, which is a nonprofit organization that is based out of Annapolis, Maryland, where we work with a variety of scientists who care about these emerging issues, and they kind of want to go about data collection in a slightly unique and different way. We collaborate with a number of the specialists who are paying attention to the marine debris pollution problem, ocean acidification, climate change, and biodiversity population concerns. And working with some of these specialists and discussing standards of procedure and what kind of data they could use if they could just get a boat, you know, get the funds, get the time and space on those big research vessels to get out there and get the information they need so they can start answering questions about how this is going to impact the relationship between man and ocean as generations go by. And so what we're able to provide is old technology, a sailing research platform, and we're able to preserve and continue the spirit of science data collection by sailboat offshore. Offshore in remote environments, we're able to be out there for long dwell times with a small, compact team of scientists, sailors, mariners, and explorers. And we're able to do this in a environmentally benign way. It's low cost and very little need for the use of fossil fuels for what we're doing. Now, you can't do everything on medium-sized sailing research vessels. And there's a lot of things we can't do that the big ships, you know, they can do things like deep ocean drilling and manage very large robotics. But technology is getting smaller and more robust, and we see that there's a future potentially for these alternative, affordable, medium-sized sail-based research vessels that can be coupled and augment the big research vessel goals. All right, so since 2012, the focus of our research expeditions has been truly the marine debris pollution problem. And after consulting and developing our partners in this research, we have certain questions that we're looking at. How much plastic is out there? What are the bounds of this plastic debris? Are they truly kept within these gyre systems that we have all heard about? Also, what harmful toxins are truly within this plastic debris that's floating and becoming part of the marine environment? And what microbacterial communities are thriving on this plastic, and what is their role? And then there's concerns with some of this bacteria being potentially introduced as invasive species in certain parts of the world. So a lot of questions here, and we had a lot of energetic scientists who are very interested in getting their hands on this data. And so that's what we were there for. So this says 2014 to 2015, but it was actually in 2013 and 2014, we had a 2-year plastic pollution survey where we identified the gaps in understanding the characterization of the plastic pollution in certain areas of the North Atlantic Gyre and the North Pacific Gyre. So we did a lot of, again, totally relying on modern-day GIS software to overlay where the previous surveys, reconnaissance surveys have been done in the Pacific and the Atlantic, and then overlaying prevailing winds and currents to help us plan where best to collect these samples, and then also to help with analysis later. So we heavily rely on GIS. I don't see that changing. And so we had this 2-year plastic pollution survey, some 16,000 miles, all sailboat. And what we were able to do is, by working with the Five Gyres Institute, Sea Education, and the International Pellet Watch program that's in University of Tokyo, we were able to start to get a better idea of how this plastic is affecting the marine environment. Dr. Marcus Erickson just came up with an estimate, and using some of the data sets that we provided him, that there is about 5.5 trillion plastic particles currently floating on the surface of our ocean. And that's about 269,000 tons. So that's current estimates right now. And Dr. Shige Takada of University of Tokyo was indeed able to identify that, yes, there are persistent organic pollutants within those plastics. And what's very interesting here is that when using these survey trawls that we put over the side of the boat for a designated period of time to collect samples during our transect, It's very difficult to capture the smaller material. So from 0.33 to 1 millimeter, there isn't much of a representation of plastic at that particle size, because it starts to grind up smaller and smaller, and eventually, and this is where future research is going to be going towards with the marine debris problem, is looking at where is this small stuff going? Is it becoming part of the water chemistry? Is it all being ingested by marine species? Or is it becoming a deposit on the seafloor? Those are things that we're going to be looking into. Dr. Takata Shige did identify persistent organic pollutants inside of these microplastics on the surface of the ocean. And so that includes a nice soup of pesticides and phthalates and PCBs, as well as the actual chemical makeup of some of these plastics have fire retardant chemicals that may have been banned in some countries, but not all. And so you're getting this really toxic material that's starting to bioaccumulate in the food chain. And the scary thing about a lot of these chemicals is that they mimic hormones. And so what that ends up doing is causing reproduction cycle issues and acting as carcinogenic. And it's very important for us that with all of the projects that we are involved with, besides having partnerships with folks that are leading the research and scientific questions in these emerging problems, we have an output of contributing to local education. So primarily, there's been a lot of STEM education programs popping up with a lot of the public schools. So we interact with these STEM students and science, technology, engineering, and math. And we have internships. We coordinate citizen science activities where the students and even parents can work together to characterize a marine debris plastic pollution sample in the middle of the ocean. So they can be directly involved with our projects, whether we're offshore or whether we're back on land, and can get them involved. When we crossed the Pacific last summer, we had about 80 co-bloggers writing about the causes and the solutions to the marine debris problem. And this was a bunch of middle school kids that had some summer homework and were involved with us during that process. So that was pretty fun. And up next, we're headed to the Arctic. As we're saying, numbers are showing there's a steady increase in warmth up there. A lot of the glaciers and ice sheets in jeopardy. And apparently, the ice sheet in Greenland, once melted, will raise the sea level about 7 meters, which will be the largest contribution from the Arctic. So you have all that that mixing glacial runoff water and chemicals, and what you end up seeing is that it's a great basin to do some preliminary research in the changes. So we're going to look at ocean acidification with the Virginia Institute of Marine Sciences, Dr. Bronk, and we're going to take a look and try to see if we can find nitrogen fixers. If there's evidence of nitrogen fixation, then we'll have a little better idea of the role of plankton up in the Arctic marine environment. And we're also going to take a look at marine debris to see if marine debris is getting up into that region. What kind of bacterial communities are we going to find on the marine debris up in that environment? And we're also going to be testing out a PCO2 carbon sensor that's designed by the Smithsonian Environmental Research Center, Dr. Miller. And the idea with his system is this is supposed to be a robust, intuitive piece that hopefully we can get on other research vessels, kind of creating a citizen science data collection of coastal carbon along the eastern seaboard and up through the Baffin Bay. And those are some of the things that we're going to be getting involved with shortly. Again, taking the old sailboat model, but environmentally benign, and combining that with today's latest technologies. We are developing a relationship with a company called Intuitive Machines, where we're hoping to be able to have technology in the air and the water, autonomous equipment. So a fixed-wing aerial drone, they are in development currently, doing all kinds of tests. We were hoping to have it on board this year, but it's looking like it'll have to wait for a year, 2 or 3. You know how testing various technology can take some time. One of the things that as I've started to get more involved with communicating with K through 12 students through the STEM programs, is that I don't see a lot of young girls stepping up, being interested in the environment, in making the connection that science and math and technology shouldn't put them off if they're very interested in doing what they can to preserve the land-based environment or marine-based environment. So I'm doing what I can to stir their interest and get them involved. Thank you.
Okay, we have time for 3 questions. Anyone have a question for these speakers? Wait.
I'd like each of you to tell us what you see are the current restrictions or limitations of geospatial analysis and where you would like to see it go.
One of the challenges that I'm having, so let's see, 2008, 2009, I went back to school to get a master's degree in geography, and part of geography, you take cartography classes, and my cartography teacher said, hey, you should check out this GIS. So I kind of fell into GIS, and once I fell in, I stuck with it. But, my background is anthropology, linguistics, geography, and I've got a little artistic talent, so that's my segue into GIS, and I'm primarily responsible for training. But what I'm seeing where things are going is the more need, developers. We just started a new developer subgroup. So we've got all these GIS people, a lot of people who are geographers are now having to go into the realm of coding, because at least that's where Esri is taking us, and that's where, if you want to go beyond that step, you have to have those abilities. So, I tell people, I do a lot of outreach with students, and I tell students, take some programming classes, you have to do that. So that's not, is it going to be a challenge? Well, people who are in the industry now who don't have that skill, it's going to be a challenge for us. But I think if we need to convey that to people coming through, that this is part of it. It's not just making maps anymore. It's not just knowing your data anymore, but you're going to have to know how to program and do some code writing. And at this stage in my career, I'm not jumping on that boat. It's too late for me. My co-lead at the region, he's a 30-year-old guy, and he's 30. His brain is still resilient, but I think that's part of something that's when you think about geography, you don't think about programming, and that's a new. We're always talking about the future. We're talking about all these technological changes, and we got to stay on top of that.
For me, I look at it from the data standpoint. We have a lot of data out there. We still have a relatively poor mechanism to share that data effectively, to preserve that data. I work with the Federal Geographic Data Committee on the Historic Working Group, where we look at preservation issues, but we also look at collecting and depositing the data into a warehouse-type environment. The federal government is, but it works with the state and local agencies as well. The data is really the key, and also the storage of it. So those are some of the big issues that are facing GIS application in the future, because we're so reliant on that. That's what it's really all about, is being able to do analysis with these data and making sure that we have those data available to us.
I think compatibility is one of the biggest time sinks for trying to move forward and analyze any geographic questions you may have that have to do with multiple data sets, maybe coming from different organizations. And I hope bringing to light to the younger and new GIS users how to look at the compatibility issues and how to find the solutions in a way that's going to reduce the amount of time and not discourage new users. So.
We're going to catch up, and we'll have Bob Rhodes come up to introduce our next speaker. And thank you very much. Let's give them a hand.
Okay, there you are. My name is Bob Rhodes. I work in this building in the Geography and Map Division, but I'll talk about that a little bit later. I just wanted to mention that today has been a real treat for me to hear all the presentations this morning and earlier this afternoon. This is the stuff that gets me up in the morning, so thank you very much. Also experienced a treat today to run into a couple of friends who I haven't seen for years. Helen Shepard over here, who is one of the SWIG, is that what you call it, SWIG members. And some years ago, she conducted these, an oral history with Marie Tharp, and I think that now resides in the Manuscripts Division. And that's a wonderful gift to the library and to America. The other treat for me today is to introduce Dr. Judith Tyner. And we met some years ago as well, downstairs in the Geography and Map. Can you hear me now? Is that okay? Of course, Judith has quite a resume, so I'm going to go through it rather quickly, even though it could go on to about 3 pages, but I'm not going to do that. Her bachelor's and master's and PhD degrees came from UCLA in geography with a cartography specialty. Her master's thesis was on lunar cartography, which is very unique. I want to talk to her about that. Her PhD dissertation was on persuasive cartography, which I know nothing about, and I want to know about that as well. At California State University at Long Beach, CSULB, she is what we would call the geographer's geographer. 35 or more years in the classroom. For any of you folks who have taught in the classroom for any number of years. 35, no, 9 or 8 or something of that sort for me, but 35 years, she's got some stories to tell, and I want to hear about those too. She taught beginning and advanced cartography, map reading and interpretation, remote sensing, and introduced the computer cartography or computer cartography into the curriculum as the first GIS class at CSULB. She founded and then directed the Cartographic GIS Certificate Program at California State University, and for 20 years. That's all very amazing to me. And she was the department chair for 6 years. And if you've been a department chair, you also have some stories to tell, of course. She continues her research with subjects like women in cartography, lunar cartography, propaganda maps, and maps on textiles, which I don't know anything about either. I know a lot about other things. I just don't know about these things. But I'm anxious to hear. She's recently authored some new textbooks here in 2010, Principles of Map Design, And then in 2014, The World of Maps, Map Reading and Interpretation for the 21st Century, and she has a new book coming out in April. You can sign up in the back room and, order your first copy, maybe. This is on stitching the world, okay. Embroidered maps and women's geographical education, coming at a bookstore near you next month. Her most recent research is a history of U.S. women cartographers, which lends itself to this subject, where she's going to talk about the tip of the iceberg. Marie Tharp, my dear friend, and I'll tell you more about that later, and women in mapping in the mid-20th century. So, Judith.
Thank you. Let's get it act together here now. Thank you very much. As you might have guessed, that my research is, shall we say, eclectic. I like to say that I do research on oddball maps, and nothing very formal. I'm also pleased, been thinking about the title of this session, this conference, Women Mapping the World. And yet I still keep finding articles. In fact, there was a blurb in the AARP magazine, of all places, about how women can't read maps. I didn't think anybody in this room would agree with that one. Okay. Well, again, thank you for inviting me. This is a presentation that is a variation on what I did last year here at the Library of Congress for a different organization, but I've kind of tweaked it a little bit. And as you can see, for some time, I've been looking at women in American cartography. And probably the best known woman cartographer of the mid-20th century is Marie Tharp. Now, when I talk to people who are not in the field and I say about Marie Tharp, they haven't a clue, it turns out, so she's not that famous, I guess. But they do know about the continents and that they move, and so the impact is there. But for the last 20 or so years, she wasn't even well known to the scientific community at large. It was only in her later years that she received recognition and honors for her work on mapping the world's oceans. And there are many others who also worked in obscurity and only recently were recognized. So today, what I'm going to do is paraphrase Lloyd Brown, who wrote a classic work on cartography. And he said in his first paragraph, "This is the story of maps, the men who made them." Well, I'm looking at the story of maps in the 20th century, the women who made them, okay? Now, there have been women working in cartography in the United States since before the 20th century. Let's see if we can make this thing work. Aha, okay. I'm a little ahead of the game, but I wanted to be sure it worked. There have been women working in cartography in the United States before the 20th century, and some, such as Emma Willard and Sarah Cornell, who you may not have heard of, produced school atlases in the 19th century, and they were quite well known in their time. But today, I'm going to focus on the impact of World War II and how it opened the doors to the women in the field. And I won't confine myself to just the mid-20th century. I'll wander a little closer to the 21st at times. And in the interest of time, I'm only going to focus on the United States, although Great Britain, Canada, Germany were also impacted. The 20th century, and especially the period around World War II, marks a watershed in cartography, and especially in the role of women. Most people are familiar with Rosie the Riveter, and we have here in the Norman Rockwell painting. She was the iconic woman factory woman who was building planes and other necessary war equipment. The Rosies have recently been honored, and in 2000, the Rosie the Riveter World War II Homefront National Heritage Park, there's a mouthful, was opened, and in 2007, I'm proud to say, my town of Long Beach, California, dedicated the Rosie the Riveter Park, which is adjacent to the former Douglas Aircraft Factory, where many Rosies worked. In April of last year, a group of Rosies were honored at the White House, and you can see Vice President Biden greeting them there. Historians have become more interested in women's war work, and there have been a number of books out lately. The Girls of Atomic City by Denise Kiernan, and more recently, Soundings by Hallie Felt, who tells the story of Marie Tharp. Women in Cartography, a group that I've decided to call Millie the Mapper, as analogous to Rosie the Riveter, has had less study and recognition, although in 2013, Mary DeLong wrote a master's thesis on women in cartography and geography during the period and used 7 women as case studies. She used Helen Strong, Edith Parker, Clara Laguerre, Lois Olson, Margaret Kingman, Betty Didcot Burrell, Evelyn Pruitt, a few names you might have heard of today. Okay, well, let's get on with Marie Tharp, since that's our tip of the iceberg here. As I noted earlier, she's probably the best-known woman in cartography, but a brief summary of her career, I think, is in order, because there are at least 2 oral histories of her, one by the Society of Women Geographers, which is absolutely fascinating reading, and then all of her materials are now at the Library of Congress that document her career, and so it's a little easier to look at her career than it is for a lot of other, especially women map makers. Tharp was born in 1920, and she has said, or had said, that she owed her career to World War II, and that she wouldn't have made her discoveries if it weren't for the war. Her father, whom she greatly admired, was a soil surveyor. So she's here with her father on his truck. She often went with him on his surveys, and she developed an early interest in maps. We see her here with a plane table making a map. She looks to be about 10, 12 years old. When she entered Ohio University about 1939, the careers open to women were secretary, nurse, or teacher, as was mentioned earlier today. As she said, she couldn't type, she couldn't stand the sight of blood, and that left teaching. Didn't really interest her, but that was kind of what she could do. She changed her major on a regular basis. I can relate to that. I think I went through 3 or 4. She was looking for something that would appeal, and so she ultimately graduated in 1943 with majors in English and music and 4 minors. Her last year, she took a geology class, and she saw a notice posted for women to study geology at the department at the University of Michigan. The women were guaranteed a job in the petroleum industry. And as a sidelight, a major impact of the war was that as men enlisted or were drafted, traditionally male university departments, such as geology and civil engineering, were decimated. Normally, these departments didn't encourage, or in many cases, even admit women students, that fieldwork thing again. But in order to survive, those departments had to change, at least for a while. So Tharp went to Michigan, and she became one of the PG girls, the petroleum geology girls. When she completed her Master of Science degree, she accepted a job in Tulsa in the oil industry, but she didn't really like that either, because as a female, she couldn't go into the field. Now, mind you, this is a girl who from childhood was out there in the field with her dad. But she couldn't go into the field, and the job didn't challenge her. So while she was there, she got another bachelor's degree, this time in mathematics. After the war, she moved to New York, still looking for something interesting to do, and was hired at Columbia University's Lamont Geological Observatory. The main qualification that interested the head of the laboratory, Maurice Doc Ewing, wasn't her geology degree, but her ability to draft. And in fact, apparently that was one of the things that he asked in the interview, kind of as a last resort, can you draft? And she said yes, and so she was hired. So she began working with Bruce Hazen, who was another newcomer to the lab. Bruce was a PhD student at the time, and he went to sea taking soundings. And Marie remained on shore because women couldn't go on Navy ships. She was converting those soundings to elevation maps. She used methods devised by Armand K. Lobeck of Columbia University and began to create a physiographic diagram of the topography of the ocean. That beautiful map that we've seen earlier today and you're going to see again, it was not drawn by Tharp or Hazen. This is what Marie Tharp worked on. This is what her map looked like. At any rate, she was building this physiographic diagram of the oceans, and the story, of course, is very well known now, but she noticed a rift valley in the middle of the Mid-Atlantic Ridge. When she showed it to Hazen, he said, that's girl talk, because it would support the theory of continental drift, and that was a crackpot idea. So ultimately, Marie's discovery changed the face of geology. On a personal note, when I finished my master's degree, continental drift was a hypothesis. When I returned 5 years later to begin my PhD, it was the accepted fact. That's how fast the turnover was, as we've also heard. The well-known, as I said, Portrait of the Oceans map, this one, is based on the Tharp and Hazen work, and it was painted by Heinrich Baron. Hazen died in 1977, but Marie continued to work on her maps until her retirement in 1982. And at that time, when she retired from Lamont, she formed a company to sell maps. Okay. She was honored by the Society of Women Geographers with a Lifetime Achievement Award in 1996. And in 1997, she was honored by the Philip Lee Phillips Society of the Library of Congress. The Woods Hole Oceanographic Laboratory honored her as a woman pioneer in oceanography. And she was given the first Lamont Doherty Honors Award in 2001 and was inducted posthumously into the National Geospatial Intelligence Agency Hall of Fame in 2013. Now, as I mentioned earlier, there have been at least 2 oral histories of Tharp. And the Tharp-Hazen papers are at the Library of Congress. We're going to hear about this. But this is mind-boggling. I mean, I think my desk and office are untidy. But the Tharp and Hazen papers includes not only papers, but photographs, slides, and stuff. It totals about 30,000 items. We going to look at all of them tomorrow? Okay. Just some of the materials that are at there that we will presumably see. This globe I find particularly interesting. Okay. Tharp is deservedly well known, but she's only the tip of the iceberg, which is why I called it that. What of the other women of that period? What about the other 99% of the iceberg, the women who worked in World War II at cartography and during the period after? Tharp got her start because of the shortage of women in geology departments, but hundreds of others became cartographers, at least temporarily, because of a 2-pronged problem. First, a shortage of maps, and second, a shortage of men to make the maps. Okay. Even before Pearl Harbor, the Army recognized that our maps were woefully inadequate. In the summer of 1941, while still officially at peace, the Army called on the Tennessee Valley Authority, the TVA, to make maps of U.S. coastal areas that were perceived as potential Nazi invasion sites. After December 7th of 1941, for those of you who are too young to know that, the United States needed maps for 2 fronts. And the Pacific Ocean maps were even more antiquated and scattered than those on the east coast of the United States. Thus, on December 17th, President Roosevelt signed a bill that provided additional funding for completion of mapping in areas the Army designated as strategic. Okay? And this is the call that went out. Okay? And I will read the last sentence. The men should, of course, be young and able-bodied, should preferably have a scientific background, and have completed a short course especially directed toward the work. The plan was for the Army Corps of Engineers to receive money and distribute it to subcontractors, including the United States Geological Survey, the U.S. Forest Survey, the Soil Conservation Service, and the TVA. Each of them would produce maps of the designated area. The Committee on Education and Training for Defense Mapping detailed plans in an open letter to the newly formed Congress on Surveying and Mapping. For training, the committee hoped that engineering schools would establish courses for both engineering and liberal arts students. The 5 courses that were required were topographic map drafting, 2 courses on surveying instruments and surveying field procedure, plane table topography, and photogrammetry. After completing the courses, the student could take the civil service exam and earn from $1,440 to $1,620 per year. Okay. That was big money back then. The first 4 months of 1942, 99 courses were approved at 57 institutions in 30 states. And a funny thing happened on the way to the war. There were 2 big surprises. First, there was a growing tendency for women students to enroll in the courses. And in fact, some agencies even indicated a preference for women for certain types of work, for drafting, for computing, for photogrammetry. During the course of the program and education, the training courses in cartography and topographic drafting had more women than men enrolled. Millie the Mapper was born. The second surprise was that although the assumption was that the departments involved in training would be civil engineering or surveying, because the 14 members of the Committee on Education and Training were all professors of engineering or surveying, in actuality, some of the departments were geography departments, and many of the men and women involved in mapping at other government agencies, notably the OSS, the Office of Strategic Services, which was the predecessor to the CIA, were geographers. Well, what did the women do? This is a list of women in geography and cartography from 1941 to 1953. It's not a complete list for those of you who are close enough to read it. It is not complete. I am always adding to it, and I will be updating it again soon. But by the end of the war, thousands of women had been involved in cartographic work at all levels. Drafting, geographic research, libraries, training in cartography and map reading were all included. The majority of the women who were employed were at the sub-professional level, as drafters, junior engineering drafter, cartographic drafter, topographic drafter, photogrammetric draftsman. Actually, at the time, it was draftsman, so. Those were the lowest levels, but then there was also the chief cartographic, topographic, photogrammetric, etc. draftsman, which were the highest of the sub-professional levels. Although probably the primary reason for women entering these jobs was the lack of available men to fill them, another reason was the high level of pay. As I said, $1,640 in 1942 was a considerable sum. It was equivalent to maybe $25,000 today, which isn't, the best paying job in the world, but on the other hand, you're not living in abject poverty. And it was more than most women could earn at the time. So, last year, just as an aside, there was a TV documentary called D-Day in 3D, and it looked at the role of photo intelligence and photo interpreters in planning the D-Day invasion. And I was interested to see that many of the photo interpreters that were shown were women, although it was never mentioned or discussed in the documentary, we could see them. The Army Map Service was a major employer. In 1940, before the war, the AMS employed a total of about 100 civilian employees. There was no information on a gender breakdown. But in 1942, they had over 2,100 employees, and over 500 of them were women. A year later, the total had doubled, and the number of women went up fourfold. The highest percentage of women was 58% in 1945. The numbers dropped, as we can see here, precipitously in 1946 when the men returned and the women were terminated. The Army Map Service magazine reference points called these women, and we heard this term earlier today too, the military mapping maidens, okay, and called them the 3 M's. Now, B. McPherson, who we also heard about earlier, who worked for AMS at the beginning in 1943, said that contrary to what we might think today, how dare you call us that, they thought it was appropriate and kind of cute. They liked it. So you have to put things in the context of the time. Another major employer of women is, as I mentioned, the TVA, which was under the auspices of the Army Map Service. Beginning in March of 1942, 3 months after Pearl Harbor, they began training and employing women in drafting, computing, cartography, and photogrammetry. By early 1944, 230 women had been employed by the TVA, of whom 185 were college women and mostly graduates. 15 women got professional positions. The OSS, which was the predecessor of the CIA, had a cartographic division that was headed by Arthur Robinson. People in cartography know the name Arthur Robinson, and we genuflect when we say it, of course. But Arthur Robinson headed that division, and they hired many women cartographers, or geographers, excuse me, to do research for mapping, and also, again, as photogrammetrists. The military branches also recruited women for cartographic work. The Waves and the WACs, for instance, offered special training in cartography to officers, and here we have a couple of recruiting posters. Not all of the women who were directly employed at government agencies. One notable woman was Edith Putnam Parker, who was a geography professor and textbook author at the University of Chicago. She trained the cartographers, both male and female, as part of the Army program. She also served as the educational director of the Army Map Service Corps of Engineers. Map librarians played an important role. At the beginning of the war, not only were the maps inadequate, they were scattered in many collections throughout the country. The War Department was seeking old maps, city plans, port plans for all places outside the United States to help create new maps and for intelligence work. And the public was also asked to donate or loan maps for the duration or until they could be reproduced. Ads were placed in magazines to encourage this. And the maps were to be sent to Miss Viola Klippel, who was the head of the New York Public Library branch of the Army Map Service. NYPL was the geography section of the War Department's New York Office of Military Intelligence, which was a major user of the maps. In addition to Ms. Klippel were Clara Laguerre, who we heard about earlier, the longtime assistant chief of the geography and maps at the Library of Congress, and also Dorothy Lewis, who was the map librarian for the Department of State. Women were employed at the professional level at all agencies and also began to participate in professional organizations. One such was Elizabeth Herlihy. Elizabeth Herlihy was the chair of the Massachusetts State Planning Board. And she made a presentation at the 1944 American Congress on Surveying and Mapping meeting, and a report on her presentation is before you. And I love that even the hard-boiled engineers and surveyors were made to realize that woman's place transcends the boundaries of home. Well, despite the paternalistic tone, the reviewer was impressed, and Ms. Herlihy's paper was published as an article in the ACMS Bulletin. That's the forerunner of CAGIS, for those of you who are familiar with Cartography and Geographic Information Systems Journal. This was in January of 1945. what happened when Johnny came marching home. Even before the end of the war, there was a concern with what would happen. By 1944, the numbers of women trained in cartography and photogrammetry had made an impact, and post-war possibilities were being considered. It had been assumed that the women would terminate their employment or be terminated at the end of the war. And A.O. Quinn wrote an article in the ACSM Bulletin on women in surveying and mapping. And in the article, he reviewed women's training and their post-war probabilities. He noted that the utilization of women in the field had been hampered because colleges didn't encourage women to take science, math, and mechanical drawing, and that forced employers to provide training. However, he felt that the war had changed the outlook of colleges and that there would be better qualified women after the war. But then he made this statement that finishes up about the brief space during which the average girl works between the end of her school days and the beginning of married life. He did, however, note that there were some successful women who made this work their life careers. But in 1944, it was assumed that women would get married and that any woman with a career was not married. So Quinn also assumed that cartography was an engineering field and that both men and women would come from that field. So again, we're left with what happened when Johnny got home. Well, yeah, many of the women were terminated, usually because their jobs were given to men returning from the military. There were promises made when a guy was drafted that his job would be waiting for him when he got back. And so the women were hired in many cases knowing that this was not a forever job. But, and so usually the women who were terminated was because the guys were returning and the jobs were given to them. And that graph of Army Map Service workers makes that clear. The women drop, the women go, and the men go back up. But there were some women, especially in the professional grades, who made careers. And one of them, again, we've heard of earlier today, Evelyn Lord Pruitt, who began her career with the Coast and Geodetic Survey and later with the Office of Naval Research, and as we also heard, probably best known for coining the term remote sensing. But at the time of her retirement, she was the highest ranking woman scientist in the U.S. Navy. Another was Carol Beaver, who began her career with the Army Map Service, later moved to the National Oceanic, there we go, yeah, jet lag, and Atmospheric Administration, where she became director of the Office of Aeronautical Charting and Cartography and retired in 1996. She was an active participant in the International Cartographic Association and became co-chair of the Commission on Gender and Cartography. Another notable example of the immediate post-war period was Frances Hansen, who received a PhD in 1948. And this one is written by Frances about the applied program. The AMS was determined that it would not get caught short again, so they instituted an applied cartography program beginning in 1951. And Dr. Hansen was selected to be program director. She not only directed the program for 25 colleges and universities, she also developed the visual and textual materials used in the program. An indication that not all women planned on returning to homemaking after the war can be seen in the growing membership of professional organizations. The American Congress on Surveying and Mapping was founded in 1941. It had 163 members. They were all male. But in 1942, 4 women had joined, and by 1946, there were 24 women members. The American Society of Professional Geographers, which later merged with the AAG to be a part of the Association of American Geographers, in 1946 listed 110 women members, 20% of whom expressed interest in cartography. Probably a great many of the others were teachers. And the AAG made a preliminary list of members with a special interest in cartography. There were 252 members who responded. 40 of them were women. It would seem to me unlikely that a woman would join a professional organization if she didn't intend to continue working in that field. The majority of women cartographers worked in business or government, and their positions ranged from low-level drafting positions to supervisory jobs. Well, about this time, there were some changes in academic cartography, and these changes were for both women and men. Before World War II, while some cartography was taught in geography departments, it wasn't considered real geography. Geographers didn't write theses and dissertations or books and articles on cartographic subjects, with the occasional exception of an article on the history of cartography or on map projections. Those were legit. Women rarely taught cartography because many of the courses were taught in schools of engineering, and many of the geography departments weren't too keen on that either. Subjects like cartographic design, which is something I've been interested in, or the impact of maps on readers. How do people view maps? You know, what impact do they have? That's where the persuasive cartography comes in. These things weren't considered topics to be done in a geography department, or an engineering department for that matter. But after the war, geographers who had worked in the field as cartographers returned, and they changed cartography. They moved it into something that was called geographic cartography. And these men became mentors to a large group of women. Arthur H. Robinson, who had been in Washington, D.C. with the OSS, completed his PhD at Ohio State after the war in 1947, writing the first cartographic dissertation, The Foundations of Cartographic Methodology. This later became a classic book called The Look of Maps, which I'm pleased to say was fairly recently reissued by Esri. One of Esri's better projects lately has been reissuing some classics in the field. I'm glad to see that. Robinson became a professor at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. Yeah, okay. George Jenks was a lieutenant in the Army Air Corps, and his last assignment was as an instructor in aerial navigation, and that piqued his interest in geography. So he went to Syracuse to work on his dissertation and met the very celebrated cartographer Richard Eads Harrison. The library has some beautiful works of Harrison, and that furthered his interest in cartography. He was hired at the University of Kansas in 1949, and while there, he completed his doctoral dissertation, ironically on agricultural geography. Remember, it wasn't really real geography if you did maps. Completed his in 1950, and he developed the cartography graduate programs at Kansas. John C. Sherman was the only one of this group that wasn't in the military. He received a BA in geography in 1937 and entered Clark University that year to pursue an MA and ultimately a PhD. Norman J.W., we mustn't forget the J.W., Thrower, while only 3 or 4 years younger than Robinson, Jenks, and Sherman, did not begin teaching at UCLA until 1957. He spent the war years with the British Army in India, working on mapping and photogrammetry. At the end of the war, he returned to England and he joined the Directorate of Colonial Surveys. And it was only in 1947 that he began his academic career with a BA degree in geography from the University of Virginia and a PhD with Arthur Robinson at the University of Wisconsin-Madison in 1957. His dissertation was on cadastral surveys. Norman was a male war bride and came over with his wife and then went to school. I should say a male war groom. These 4 men were all early mentors to women graduate students in cartography. And while there was a lag between the first dissertation by a man and those by women, several women did write master's theses in cartography in the early 1960s. And in 1966, Mei-Ling Xu wrote the first cartography dissertation by a woman. Her advisor was Arthur Robinson. The 1970s brought a burst of activity for both men and women in cartography. After Mei Ling, a couple other names that you might have heard of, Barbara Bartz-Pechenik, Judy Olson, yours truly, and Helen Armstrong, Barbara Shortridge, Marlene Evans, Elizabeth Patricia Caldwell, Patricia Gilmartin, and Sona Carent Andrews. Many of these women are still fairly active. Judy Olson was the third female president of the AAG. Patricia Caldwell became president of the American Congress on Surveying and Mapping. While most of these PhDs became universities professors, as you would expect, some went into industry and some worked in both areas. Barbara Pechenik, for instance, was one of the earliest to attain high visibility in commercial map publishing. Others founded their own companies for cartographic consulting or specialty map making, as did Patricia Caldwell. By the end of the 20th century, companies such as Rand McNally and Esri had high-ranking women supervising divisions of the company. Local, state, federal government agencies, as we have seen, all employed women in design, research, and production. As a part of the emerging discipline, we have journals coming out. John Walter, who was here at the Library of Congress, he succeeded Walter Risto. He wrote a dissertation in 1975 on the emerging discipline of cartography. And in it, he noted not only the rise of geographic cartography, but also the rise in the number of professional organizations and journals in the field. I've mentioned some of the organizations, ACSM, which became CAGES. Another is NACIS, the National North American Cartographic Information Society, which publishes cartographic perspectives, the International Cartographic Association. And women have been active in publishing in these journals. And not only were women publishing, they also became officers, became active in the field. Judy Olson, she was the first woman president of the American Cartographic Association. NACIS has had 9 female presidents since 1981, and the president and president-elect of CAGES are women. Now, something else that we have to mention, I know I'm sliding a little bit away from mid-20th century here, but we have to look a little bit at the women's movement that took place. While women gained a foothold in cartography after World War II, and the women's movement in the 1960s gave an additional push. There was affirmative action and equal opportunity employment laws that made it more difficult to refuse entry to graduate programs and refuse jobs to qualified women. There were inequities remaining, however. One female cartographer, who will remain nameless, told of a prospective employer who said, "I have to interview you because you're qualified, but I don't like women in my company." Okay. When I began my PhD program, which I began a year after my husband did in the same department, my interview was quite different from his. Apparently, the department wanted to be sure I wasn't just a bored housewife looking for something to amuse me. On the other hand, looking back at the time, I had 2 kids, a husband. I could see why they might have thought that, but they took me in, of course. Professional organizations became aware of underrepresentation and did studies on women in cartography in the 1980s and 90s. The International Cartographic Association formed a commission on women and prepared a report on gender inequality in the organization. The AAG instituted a committee on the status of women. So where do we stand now? This woman here, for those who might not know her, is Eileen Buckley, who has a good position at Esri and came through cartography, so she's been in both areas. The information I'm going to have here on data is somewhat approximate because what I had to work with were lists of names that I was sent. And there are cases, many cases, where I had to guess at gender. It's amazing how many names can go either way. But the percentages are surprisingly consistent. NACIS has 1,221 members, or it did at the time that I took this, of which 355, or 29%, were female. CAGIS had 26% female. The Cartography Specialty Group of the AAG has 392 members, and approximately 112, or 29%, were female. The GIS Specialty Group of AAG has 1,206 members, of whom approximately 338, or 28%, are female. Now, of course, there's considerable overlap with, some of these are the same people, but that holds true for the men, too, or for the whole organization. If you belong to NACIS and CAGIS, you probably also belong to these two specialty groups, so it's fairly consistent. Now, one aspect that I haven't really mentioned, I've kind of touched on in places, is the role of women in GIS. Now, obviously, women are in GIS. We have heard several very interesting presentations today about women in GIS. And we saw the number of women in the specialty group, and many of these women are also in CAGIS. In 1999, there was a Society of Women in GIS that was formed. I have not yet met anybody who belongs to it, and some of the women that I talk to about it say, the what? So I'm not sure how big it is. And I haven't delved too deeply yet. But a part of the problem is that GIS is still new enough, even though it's been around for quite a while, it's still new enough that the practitioners are only now getting around to examining their history. They've been doing it, not looking at it. So one step in the right directions is this map that I have on the screen. This is a series, actually, of crowdsourced maps on women in GIS. And you can go online and say, yes, I'm in GIS, and here's where I'm located, and here's what type of GIS I do, whether I'm in the academic world or just what. But I still don't know yet. Something to amuse myself the next few years is who were the early women in GIS? What role did they play? What did they come across? So I titled this paper The Tip of the Iceberg because Tharp was the most visible female cartographer of the 20th century, mid-20th. The other women were largely hidden. They were working in agencies and companies largely based in anonymity. Conferences like this have brought many of the women out of the shadows, so to speak, and collections focused on individual women's work, such as the Tharp collection here at the library, oral histories like those done by the Society, and interviews like those that Jan Monk has carried out are vital to writing the history of women's contributions to the field of cartography and GIS. And just one final note. There was a person who I usually like to see at this kind of gathering, and that's Alice Hudson, who's a member. But yesterday, an exhibit on women in cartography, curated by Alice, opened at the Osher Map Library at the University of Southern Maine. And so Alice has been up there welcoming people to the exhibit. Okay, thank you.
I was here 15 years ago when the material came in from Nyack, New York, in 8-foot wooden crates, 12 feet high. Gary North, the late Gary North, and maybe some of you know Gary, I think that Helen does. Actually, we geographers are name droppers and place droppers, not name droppers. Gary and I met in Moscow. Okay, so we became friends, and when he got the contract here at the library, he asked me, it was just too big for one person. So the two of us worked together for about three and a half years. But while I was working on the the collection, Marie would come down occasionally to help us deal with all the questions we had about the material. She threw nothing away. Absolutely nothing. Photographs, unlabeled, slips of paper. I'm now the curator of the Heesentharp official and personal papers. This is in addition to the research work that we did back in the early 1990s. That collection, as Judith mentioned, is about 30,000 items. We haven't counted the correspondence collection, but I'm here until October, until I finish this thing. But she was just a delight. I mean, personally, I got to know her. She would arrive with a long dress all the way down to her ankles, I think a statement of the times, or her times, and field boots. Field boots that she wore when she was moving around the country with her father as a soil analyst. She attended 12 schools before she graduated from high school. So she was a moving target, and she just loved the field. And she'd have these little four-letter words that would come out now and then because she went on board ship eventually in 1965. And she got to learn some of these words that we didn't think she knew. But she threw them out there, and we said, okay, whatever you say. And she would take naps downstairs on the top one of the map cases when she was tired. We would just, the two of us, Gary and I, would get her up on the map cases are all metal, and cold. But she would sleep there for about 20 minutes and get up and then join in the conversation. I also went up to her home in Nyack. It's near the Tappan Zee Bridge on the edge of the Hudson River, and there were some flood issues along the Hudson River, as there still are. So much of the material that came in had been soaked and dried and soaked and dried. So we're dealing with mold in a big way. Intensive care for this guy because it just overtook my system at one time. We didn't know that at the time. But just to get to know her, she was a pioneer. She was in an all-male community in 1947. Everybody else at Columbia University was a male. She was the only female, and she held her own for all those wonderful years. She died in 2006 at age 86. Bruce Heesen, who she worked on the project with, was born in 1924, died in 1977 at age 53 of a heart attack off the coast of Iceland, about to go in a secret submersible to look at all the volcanic activity around Iceland. Very interesting story. And I've got many other stories because I'm going through all the personal papers, all the letters, personal letters. There was an issue between Marie and National Geographic Society about copyright issues. Bruce and Marie had a relationship other than as colleagues. Yeah, I've got the letters. I've seen them. I don't know how much of this I want to reveal to you, but you can ask me down at the reception downstairs, which I think is about to happen. And I don't want to take any more time except to introduce Min Zhang, who is the team leader of the cataloging department in the Geography and Map Division. Min?
Yes. Thank you, Bob. Hi, Bob has already mentioned I'm the head of the cataloging section downstairs, and I would like to mention this program is also co-sponsored by Philip Lee Phillips Society, and maybe most of you have already noticed there are flyers and the brochures outside on the desk, and this is one of them. If you have enjoyed today's program, please join Philip Lee Phillips Society, and you don't have to pay to be a member. But if you have enjoyed the program like I have today, and we'll be delighted to get donations from you to support the wonderful programs that, just like what we have enjoyed today, and to also to enhance and promote our extraordinary collections in the Geography Map Division in the Library of Congress to benefit worldwide scholars. Now, on behalf of our division chief, Rolf Ehrenberg, I would like to invite everyone to the reception downstairs, and we have several staff here to help lead the way, and we're probably in small groups to get the elevators. And also, I would also like to remind everyone there will be an open house in our division, and Bob will be here, and several other staff will join Bob to show you around and to showcase our wonderful collections. Enjoy. Thank you.
This has been a presentation of the Library of Congress. Visit us at loc.gov.